The snow had been falling for 3 days straight by the time Wyatt Mercer decided to ride out anyway. It wasn't bravery. He'd stopped calling it that a long time ago. It was closer to habit, the kind of stubborn, mindless routine that kept a man moving when there was nothing left inside him worth preserving. Check the north fence line, break ice off the water trough, ride the ridge to make sure the timber wolves hadn't come down close enough to worry about. He'd done it every winter for 5 years since the fever took Clara and the kids, and he'd do it every winter after until something finally stopped him. He didn't think much about what that something might be. The ridge trail was worse than he'd expected. The snow was deep enough in places to reach his horse's chest, and Old Dunn, a thick-bodied roan who'd seen enough rough country to have earned his graying muzzle, picked his way through it with the careful patience of an animal that had learned not to trust the ground in winter. The wind came in hard off the northern flats, the kind that didn't just chill you but seemed to push itself right through the spaces between your bones. Wyatt rode with his collar up and his hat pulled low. He wasn't thinking about anything in particular. That was the trick he'd learned. Keep the mind as empty as you could manage, because the moment you gave it room to wander, it went somewhere you didn't want it to go. He heard it when he crested the second ridge. He almost missed it entirely. The wind was loud enough to drown out most things, and what he heard at first could have been anything. A branch snapping under ice weight, a bird call thrown strange by the cold. But Dunn's ears went forward and the horse slowed without being asked, and Wyatt had ridden this animal long enough to know that meant something worth stopping for. He pulled up and sat still. There it was again, a human sound, high and thin, muffled by distance and snowfall, somewhere between a cry and a scream, cut off too quickly, coming from the southwest, from the direction of the Calloway place. The Calloway cabin had been empty for going on 3 years. Old Silas Calloway had packed out after the railroad deal fell through and left him holding a homestead claim worth about as much as the paper it was written on. The cabin itself was still standing, barely, half buried under the weight of the snow now, its roof pitched just steep enough to keep from collapsing, its windows dark and shuttered. Nobody had any reason to be out there. Wyatt turned Dunn and rode toward it. He wasn't moving fast, not in snow like this, but he wasn't moving cautious either. The sound he'd heard was wrong in the way that made his stomach tighten. He'd spent 11 years as a frontier scout before the fever changed everything, and he'd learned early that certain sounds had an urgency to them that bypassed thinking entirely and went straight to the part of you that knew what to do. The cabin came into view as he dropped off the ridge into the hollow. Or rather, what was recognizable of it did. The drifts had swallowed most of the structure's lower half, leaving only the top third and the chimney visible above the white. No smoke, no lamplight, nothing to suggest life. He heard the sound again when he got closer. Louder now. More than one voice. Wyatt dismounted, tied Dunn to a half-buried fence post, and waded through the snow to the cabin door. It was drifted shut, the snow packed hard against it in a sloped wall nearly 4 feet deep. He pulled his knife and worked the edge of it around the frame, trying to break the ice seal, then planted his shoulder against the wood and shoved. It gave with a sound like something breaking apart. The smell hit him first, cold and stale, and underneath it something sharp. Unwashed bodies, old fear, the particular smell of children who hadn't been warm in a very long time. The cabin interior was nearly as dark as the snow outside, the shuttered windows letting in only thin gray seams of light, and for a moment Wyatt just stood in the doorway letting his eyes adjust. Then he saw them, 6 children, tucked into the far corner like animals trying to make themselves small, pressed against the wall and against each other, some standing, some crouched, all of them staring at him with the particular look of people who have learned that a door opening does not mean safety. The oldest looked to be around 10 or 11, a lean, dark-haired boy with a bruise fading yellow on his jaw. The youngest was maybe 4. Between them, a mixed arrangement of sizes and ages, all thin, all wide-eyed, all wearing clothes that were inadequate for weather a quarter this severe. And in front of them all, standing slightly apart and slightly forward, not quite putting herself between the others and the door, but clearly thinking about it, was a girl of about 8 years old. She had her chin up, her jaw was set, her hands were balled into fists at her sides, and her dark eyes were fixed on Wyatt with an expression that was something between terror and absolute refusal to show it. Wyatt didn't move from the doorway. "Hey," he said. His voice came out rough. He hadn't talked much today. None of them answered. "Not gonna hurt you," he said. The girl's eyes tracked down to the knife he was still holding, then back up to his face. He looked down at the knife, then slowly and deliberately slid it back into its sheath on his belt. "Door was froze shut," he said. "Had to cut the ice." Still nothing. But he could see the youngest, the 4-year-old, a small boy with red raw cheeks, trembling not just from the cold. The girl in front noticed him looking and shifted slightly, blocking his view of the small boy with her own body. "How long have you been out here?" Wyatt asked. She didn't answer that either, but one of the middle children, a girl about 6, with a badly cut lip that had scabbed over, said, in a voice so small he almost missed it, 3 days. 3 days, Wyatt repeated. He looked around the cabin. No food he could see. A broken tin cup near the cold fireplace. Some rotted scraps of burlap that someone had tried to use as additional bedding. The fireplace itself was long dead. No wood, nothing to burn. "How'd you get here?" he asked. He kept his voice flat, not soft, not hard, just even. "Walked," said the girl in front. It was the first thing she'd said. Her voice was rougher than he expected, low for her age, with a steadiness to it that didn't belong on an 8-year-old's face. "Walked from where?" She looked at him for a long moment, as if she was measuring something. Not just him, but the whole situation, trying to calculate risk against need with the kind of arithmetic that children shouldn't know how to do. "The Blackthorn operation," she said, "on the east side of the Harrow River." Wyatt kept his face still. The Harrow River was nearly 18 miles away in good weather. In this weather, through this snow, on foot. He did the math and it didn't make sense, and then it did, because children who were desperate enough didn't stop to calculate what was possible. "The mining camp," he said. "The camp," she agreed. Just those 2 words. But the way she said them told him something about what that place was. He looked at the 6 of them again. Their feet, specifically. The footwear was terrible. Thin, worn, the kind of thing you put on children when you didn't care whether their feet were warm, just whether they were covered. He could see, even in the dim light, that several of them had feet that were going to need serious attention. "My name is Wyatt Mercer," he said. "I've got a ranch about 2 miles south. Got a fire, got food, got room." He paused. "Nobody there but me." The girl looked at him for another long, careful moment. "My name is May," she said. "May Hollow." "May," he repeated. "Those are my people," she said, indicating the others behind her with the slightest tilt of her head. "They come with me." "All right," Wyatt said. "All of them come." Something in her expression shifted. Not quite relief, more like a calculation coming out to a number she'd half hoped for, but hadn't trusted. She turned and said something quiet to the others that he couldn't fully hear. And then, in the slow and careful way of people who have learned that movement can be dangerous, they began to get up. Getting 6 children through nearly 2 miles of chest-deep snow with a single horse was not a simple thing. Wyatt worked it out practically. He put the youngest 2, the 4-year-old boy, whose name turned out to be Cobb, and a 5-year-old girl named Dara, who was running a fever he didn't like the look of, up on Dunn's back. He took his own coat off and wrapped it around them both, and then regretted it approximately 4 minutes later when the cold came through his shirt like a blade. He worked through it. May walked beside him without being asked to and without speaking much. The other 3, Eli, the older boy with the bruised jaw, a pair of thin, similar-looking kids of about 7 that he gathered were twins, Rue and Sabul, and a quiet 9-year-old named Petra who seemed to communicate mostly by watching, came behind, stepping in the trail that Wyatt and Dunn broke through the drifts ahead of them. They were all exhausted, that was clear. Eli, 12, he'd learn later, had the gait of someone who was operating on the edge of what a body could do. The twins held each other's hands and moved together like they'd practiced it. Petra hadn't said a word since they'd left the cabin. About half a mile out, May drew up beside Wyatt and said, without preamble, "Blackthorn's people will come looking." "I figured," Wyatt said. "He doesn't stop." "I've heard of him." "Then you know he's not somebody who stops." Wyatt glanced down at her. Her face was expressionless, her eyes on the trail ahead, her voice carrying this flat informational quality, like she was delivering a fact, not a warning, not a plea. She wasn't asking him to reconsider. She was just making sure he understood what he was getting into. I know what I'm getting into, he said. She looked up at him then, briefly, and then looked away again. She didn't say anything else about it. The ranch came into view through the snowfall as the last light was dying out of the sky. Just the dark shape of it against the white. The barn and the house and the fence lines barely distinguishable from the surrounding dark. Wyatt had built most of it himself in the year after he and Clara had come out here, back when the future still looked like something worth building toward. It wasn't much to look at. The paint on the house had weathered to almost nothing. The barn roof had developed a sag he'd been meaning to address for 2 winters. The fence needed work in about half a dozen places, but it was warm. He could feel the potential of warmth in it even from the outside. The thick log walls and the stone chimney and the wood pile stacked under the lean-to that he'd kept filled out of habit, even though it was only ever him. He got the door open and got them all inside and got the fire built up inside of 20 minutes. Then he went through the kitchen with the particular efficiency of a man who has learned to move fast when it matters and slow when it doesn't, and put together the closest thing to a proper meal he could manage from what he had. Dried beans and salt pork and some cornmeal he boiled down with water until it was thick enough to stick to a spoon. The children ate without speaking. It wasn't the quietness of children being polite. It was the quietness of people who'd learned not to make noise during meals, who'd maybe had food taken away for talking at the wrong moment, or worse. Wyatt noticed it and said nothing about it. He just put the pot back on the fire and refilled the bowls when they were empty and made sure everyone had enough before he ate anything himself. After the meal, he got a better look at their condition. Dara's fever was his first concern. He sat her near the fire and used the back of his hand to check the temperature at her neck and forehead. Hot enough to worry him, not so hot that he was in a panic yet. He got the blanket from his own bed and wrapped it around her. She gets like this, May said, from beside him. It comes and goes. She had it at the camp. And they didn't... Wyatt stopped himself. No, May said simply. He exhaled slowly. He looked at the rest of them. Feet were the next concern after Dara. He got them all seated and checked one by one, the kind of examination he'd learned in his scouting years, when knowing whether a man's feet were frostbitten or just frozen was sometimes the difference between a bad night and an amputation. Cobb and Rue had the worst of it, toes that were white and waxy in a way that made Wyatt's jaw tighten. He didn't say anything alarming out loud. He got the warmest water he could prepare without scalding and began the slow work of bringing the circulation back. May watched him do all of this. She sat on the edge of the hearth, a blanket over her shoulders, and tracked everything he did with those careful dark eyes. He noticed the resemblance again, harder to avoid in the firelight. The shape of her face, the particular set of her expression, that stubborn directness. His daughter Lena had looked at him exactly that way, the year before the fever came, had stood in the kitchen doorway with her chin up and told him she was old enough to ride the north pasture alone. And he'd argued with her for 10 minutes before giving in, which was exactly what she'd known would happen. He pushed that away. He was good at that. He'd had 5 years of practice. Where did you all come from? He asked May. Before the camp. She was quiet for a moment. Different places, she said. I came from Harrow Crossing. My mama had debts. A pause. The man Blackthorn bought the debts. Then he said we owed him instead. How old were you? 5? Wyatt looked at the fire. Tkit. Eli came from further east, she continued, unprompted, her voice still that same flat informational tone. His family sold him. They needed the money, and the man who came said Eli'd have a good situation. He didn't. And the others? Cobb doesn't remember where he's from. Dara came with her brother, but the brother didn't. He didn't make it through the first winter. Rue and Sable came together. They're sisters. Petra... May paused. Petra doesn't talk about where she came from. I don't ask. Wyatt nodded. He leaned forward and adjusted the wood in the fire, sending a brief shower of sparks up the chimney. How'd you plan the escape? He asked. She looked at him steadily. Why do you want to know? I was a scout for 11 years, he said. I know good planning when I hear about it. 18 miles through a storm, 6 of you. In the middle of winter? That's not luck. Something flickered in her expression, not quite pride, but close to it, and immediately suppressed. Eli found the gap in the fence, she said. I knew the ridge would give us cover from the riders. I'd been watching the patrol routes for 2 months. She paused. I was wrong about how long the snow would be. I thought we'd find shelter sooner. You did find shelter, Wyatt said. Not fast enough. Dara was already sick before we left. She's going to be okay, he said. He said it because he needed to say something, and because it was probably true, and because May was 8 years old and had been carrying these people across a blizzard on nothing but nerve and planning. May looked at him for a moment and didn't respond to that. She wasn't the type to be comforted by words she couldn't verify. Eli found Wyatt later that night when most of the younger ones had finally fallen into sleep near the fire. The boy came out of the shadows on the far side of the room and stood there for a moment without speaking, his arms folded across his chest in a way that wasn't casual, more like he was trying to hold himself together from the outside. Can I ask you something? Eli said. Go ahead. The boy was quiet for another moment. Up close, in the firelight, the bruise on his jaw was older than Wyatt had first thought, fading at the edges, a week or more along. But there was something else in his expression beyond the bruise, something that sat deeper. When we were leaving, Eli said, his voice coming out carefully, like he was picking each word for weight. One of the guards came after us, at the fence. A pause. I had a piece of iron from the forge. I hit him with it. Another pause, longer. He didn't get up. Wyatt looked at him. I don't know if he's... Eli's jaw worked. I don't know. You were protecting the others, Wyatt said. Yeah, but... There's no but, Wyatt said, and then caught himself because that wasn't quite honest. There is a but. What you're feeling, that weight you've got right now. That's real, and it should be there. A man who does something like that and feels nothing about it is a man I'd worry about. But you did what you did to get them out. That matters too. Eli stared at the floor. It doesn't feel like it matters right now. No, Wyatt said. It won't for a while. That's the honest answer. He paused. But you got them out. 6 of you walked 18 miles through a blizzard, and 6 of you are here in front of this fire. That's because of you and May both. The boy's throat worked. He didn't say anything else. After a moment, he went back to his spot near the fire and pulled a blanket over his shoulders and lay down, and Wyatt watched his breathing slowly, eventually, go even. Wyatt sat up through most of that night. He kept the fire going, checked on Dara's fever every hour or so, made sure the children who were sleeping stayed covered. Outside, the storm pressed against the walls and the windows with a sound like something trying to get in, and the lantern on the table threw a circle of yellow light that made the room feel smaller and safer than it was. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold sometime around midnight and looked at nothing in particular. 5 years ago, he had sat at this same table with Clara while the kids slept, planning the spring planting, arguing about whether to put in a kitchen garden or hold off another year. Clara had wanted the garden immediately. She always wanted things immediately. He'd been the cautious one, always figuring the angles, always waiting to be sure. She'd called it his worst habit. She'd been right about most things. He thought about what May had told him. 5 years old. Debts her mother owed. A man named Blackthorne who had a way of turning other people's trouble into his own advantage. He'd heard of Edgar Blackthorne in the way that people out on the frontier heard about powerful men. In pieces, at distances, the details blurring into something that felt like rumor, but probably wasn't. Mining interests along the Harrow River. Political connections that went all the way back east to people who wore good clothes and had soft hands and made decisions that affected everyone out here without ever having to ride through a single winter. The kind of man who never personally got blood on his hands because he had people for that. And the kind of man who never personally broke a law because he had judges for that. The kind of man who would, in fact, not stop. Wyatt wrapped both hands around the cold cup of coffee and thought about that. He thought about the things he'd lost and the things he'd stopped expecting to have again. And then he looked at the 6 small shapes arranged in front of his fireplace. May curled on her side with her jaw still set, even in sleep. Eli flat on his back, staring at the ceiling until sleep finally claimed him. Cobb tucked between the twins with one hand wrapped around Rue's sleeve. He thought about the ranch, which was big enough for more than one person had ever occupied it. About the woodpile that he kept full out of nothing but stubbornness. About the spare room and the loft and the fact that the bed in that spare room had been made up with clean sheets for 2 years because he hadn't been able to bring himself to unmake it.
He wasn't the kind of man who made grand decisions. He was the kind of man who did the next thing in front of him and the next thing after that. He'd always been that way. Clara had said it was the thing that kept them alive, and also the thing that made her want to throw a pot at him.
He got up from the table, went to the window and looked out at the white dark of the storm. Somewhere out on the other side of that, somewhere past the ridge and the river and the 18 miles of frozen country, was a man named Blackthorne who would, in the morning or the next morning or the morning after that, notice that 6 children were gone. Who would do whatever accounting a man like that did, calculate the value of the investment lost, and begin the process of recovering it? Wyatt stood at the window for a long time. Then he turned around, went back to the table, and began to think. Not about whether he was keeping them. He'd made that decision the moment he'd turned done toward the sound in the hollow. He knew himself well enough to know he'd made it even before he'd opened the cabin door, when he'd heard those voices and ridden toward them instead of away. What he was thinking about now was how. Because May was right. Blackthorne wouldn't stop. And running was an option, but running with 6 children across open country in the dead of winter with a sick 5-year-old was a particular kind of slow suicide. And hiding was an option, but a man like Blackthorne would have riders and money and reach. And eventually a hiding place stopped being one. That left something else, something harder and less certain. He turned it over in his mind the way he used to plan route scouting, looking at the terrain, looking at what was fixed and what could be moved, looking at where the high ground was. He didn't have an answer yet, but he was thinking about one. May found him at the window sometime before dawn. He heard her behind him, quiet on her feet, the way children who'd spent years around people who meant them harm learned to be, and didn't turn around at first. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you," she said. He turned then. She was standing in the middle of the room, the blanket still around her shoulders, her dark eyes finding him in the low firelight. "Blackthorne has a man named Creel," she said. "He's the one who does the tracking. He's good." "I believe you." "He won't wait for the storm to break all the way. He'll come as soon as there's enough of a trail to follow." "Then we've got maybe 2 days," Wyatt said, "depending on how fast this lets up." She looked at him steadily. "What are we going to do?" He found it interesting that she said we. He didn't comment on it. "I'm still working on that," he said honestly. She seemed to think about this. "You could put us out," she said. "Tell them we came and went. Nobody'd have to know." "No," Wyatt said. "It would keep you safe." "May," he said, and waited until she was looking directly at him. "I'm not putting you out. That's done. I'm not revisiting it." She held his gaze for a long moment. He couldn't tell if she believed him or was just deciding whether it was worth arguing about. Then she nodded once, a short, contained motion, and went back to the fire. He turned back to the window. The snow was still falling, but lighter now. By morning, the storm might have broken enough to see the ridge. He needed to think about Blackthorne, about the law, about what kind of play a man made when he was outnumbered and out-resourced, but still had one thing the other side didn't. He didn't have the answer yet. But standing there at the window in the blue dark before dawn, listening to 6 children breathe behind him, he was closer to it than he'd been to anything in 5 years that felt like it mattered. Outside, the snow kept falling, quieter now, softer, beginning very slowly to ease. The storm broke some time before noon on the second day. Wyatt knew it before he looked out the window, knew it by the change in sound, the way the wind dropped from a sustained roar to something intermittent, gusting in fits and then going quiet in a way that felt almost tentative. He'd spent enough winters on this ridge to read the silence the way other men read print. The snow was done. The cold wasn't, not by a long measure, but the active part of the storm had moved on east and left behind the particular still brightness of a frontier morning after heavy snowfall, everything white and sharp and almost painfully clear. He stood at the window with his second cup of coffee and looked out at a world that had been remade overnight into something that looked clean, whether it was or not. Behind him, the ranch house had a different quality to it than it had in 5 years. Not louder, exactly. Most of the children were still sleeping, and even the ones who were awake moved quietly out of a habit he was coming to understand was trained rather than natural.
But there was a kind of weight to the air that came from other people occupying space, breathing, existing in the same walls. He hadn't realized how completely he'd forgotten what that felt like until it came back.
Dara's fever had broken around midnight. He'd checked her twice in the night, and the second time her skin was cooler and she was sleeping more easily, her small chest rising and falling with something like regularity. He'd let himself feel relief about that carefully, in pieces, the way you tested ice before you put your full weight on it. He was refilling his cup when May appeared from the direction of the back room where he'd put the girls. May, Dara, Rue, Sable, and Petra, arranged on every blanket and piece of spare bedding he owned. She moved through the kitchen like she was checking something, her eyes going to the window, to the door, to him, and then to the fire in a quick circuit that was less like a child waking up and more like someone running through a list. "Storm's done," she said. "Yes." "Creel will move." "Probably." He poured coffee into the second cup he'd set out. He wasn't entirely sure why he'd set out a second cup, only that it seemed like the right thing, and pushed it across the table toward the spot where she'd likely stand. She looked at the cup and then at him, and then pulled out the chair and sat down. She wrapped both hands around the cup but didn't drink from it right away, just held it. "How's Dara?" she asked. "Better. Fever broke." Some of the tension in May's shoulders let go. Not all of it, just a layer of it, like a coat coming off. "She does that," May said. "Gets sick and then gets better. She's tougher than she looks." "I believe it." May looked at the window. "What's the plan?" Wyatt sat down across from her. He'd been thinking through the night, turning the problem from different angles, and he had something now. Not a complete answer, but a shape of one. "First thing is, I ride to Harlan's Crossing," he said. "There's a man there, Jonas Frey, who runs the trading post. He's got a wire and he knows people in the county seat. I need to get word to a marshal I know, man named Aldous Crane. He's honest, which makes him unusual out here." May looked at him. "A marshal," she repeated, and her tone had something in it. Not quite skepticism, more like a person who'd learned that official authority and actual protection were not the same thing. "I know," Wyatt said. "I know how that sounds. But Crane's different from most. He doesn't take money from people like Blackthorn." He paused. "Or if he does, he hasn't started yet." "That's not a very confident endorsement." "No, it isn't, but it's what we've got." He drank his coffee. "Second thing is we don't run. Running puts us in open country with 6 kids, one of whom is just off a fever, and gives Blackthorn's riders exactly the kind of ground they work best on. We stay here." May was quiet for a moment. "And if Blackthorn gets here before your marshal does, then we deal with that." She looked at him for a long beat. "You're not scared," she said, and it came out less like an accusation and more like a thing she was trying to figure out. "I didn't say that," Wyatt said. "I said we deal with it." She seemed to consider the distinction. Then she drank her coffee, both hands still around the cup, her eyes staying on him over the rim, and didn't say anything else about it. The children woke in stages through the morning, drifting into the kitchen in ones and twos drawn by the smell of the oats he'd put on the fire. Cobb came first, padding out in socks that were 3 sizes too big, Wyatt's spare pair, which he'd found for the boy the night before, and climbed onto the bench seat without being invited and sat there watching the pot with the focused attention of someone who'd learned not to assume a meal was real until it was in front of him. "Morning," Wyatt said. Cobb looked at him. He was 4 years old, round-faced, with a crease of sleep still pressed into his cheek. He didn't say good morning back. He just looked at Wyatt for a careful moment and then looked back at the pot. "You want to stir it?" Wyatt asked. Cobb's eyes came back to him. Wyatt held out the wooden spoon. After a moment, a genuine moment of weighing it, Cobb slid off the bench and came around to the fire and took the spoon. He stirred the oats with serious, dedicated attention, and Wyatt stood back and let him do it, and didn't say anything about how he was also sloshing some of it onto the hearthstone. Eli came in next, then the twins together as always, then Petra. Dara slept another hour while the others ate, and when she finally appeared in the kitchen doorway, she looked washed out and fragile in a way that made Wyatt glad the fever had broken when it did. May steered her to the warmest spot on the bench and put a bowl in front of her without being asked. They ate. It was quiet, but it was a different quiet than the night before. Less braced, less watchful. Not comfortable yet, not by a long way. but fractionally less afraid. He could see it in the small things, Cobb's feet swinging under the bench, Rue whispering something to Sable that made Sable press her lips together to keep from smiling, Petra, who still hadn't said a word to Wyatt directly, watching him from across the table with eyes that were wary but no longer quite panicked. After breakfast, Wyatt pulled on his coat and hat and told May he was going to check the barn, that he'd be back inside a half hour. She looked at him. "You're going to Harlan's Crossing?" "Just to check the barn first," he said. "It's 4 hours' ride to Harlan's Crossing. 3.5 in clear weather." "Then you should go," she said. Not a question, not permission either. More like she was telling him that his plan was acceptable and he could proceed. He almost said something about that, but decided against it. "Keep the door barred," he said. "Don't open it for anyone who isn't me. Anyone tries to tell you different, there's a rifle above the fireplace. You know how to use one?" She gave him a look that said the question was unnecessary. "All right," he said. "I'll be back before dark." He turned to go and she said behind him, "Wyatt." He stopped. "Be careful," she said. Her voice was flat and informational about it, the way it was about most things, but it was still the first time she'd said his name. "Planning on it," he said. He was gone nearly 5 hours. The ride to Harlan's Crossing was hard going. The snow was deep and drifted across the trail in places that made Dunn work for every yard. But the cold was clear and still, and the sky overhead was a flat, pale blue that gave him enough light to move fast where the trail was visible. He got to the trading post a little past midday, tied up outside, and found Jonas Frey exactly where he always was, behind the counter sorting nails into a tin with the focused expression of a man who found order in small things. Jonas looked up. "Wyatt Mercer. You're out in this?" "Need to use your wire." Jonas studied him for a moment, reading something in his face. "This official?" "It's important," Wyatt said. "I need to reach Aldous Crane." Jonas set down his tin. "Crane's in Mineral Fork, last I heard. That's 2 relay stations. Might take time." "However long it takes. I'll wait." He sent the wire, keeping it short and factual. 6 children. Escaped labor camp. Blackthorn operation on the Harrow. Coming to my ranch. Need legal authority fast. He paid Jonas for the wire and for a pound of dried beans and a sack of flour and 2 tins of lard because the ranch stores weren't built for 8 people, and he needed to think ahead. He also stopped at the edge of town and spoke with a man named Deke Pruitt, who was the closest thing Harlan's Crossing had to a lawman. More of a loose arrangement than an official appointment, but Deke had a badge and enough sense to know what it was for. He told Deke what was happening in enough detail to be clear about the severity and not enough to give Deke a reason to feel like he needed to get involved immediately. Because Deke was honest but also cautious in the way of men who had families to think about, and Wyatt needed information more than he needed Deke to do something he'd decide against later. What Deke told him was this. Blackthorn's man Creel had ridden through town 2 days ago, asking questions. He'd been looking for a group of runaways from the mining operation. He'd had papers, the kind that were stamped and official-looking, and he'd spoken to 3 people that Deke knew of before moving on east. "East," Wyatt said. "Not south?" "East," Deke confirmed. Figured they'd run for the river crossing. Wyatt thought about that. May had come south instead of east, which meant she'd either known something about the patrol patterns or she'd gotten lucky. And from what he'd seen of May, he didn't think it was luck. He rode back faster than he'd come. The afternoon light was going orange and flat by the time the ranch came into view, and the first thing he noticed was the smoke from the chimney, steady and even, which meant someone was managing the fire properly. And the second thing he noticed was that the front window showed lamplight, which meant they'd lit the lamp without being told to, which meant they were comfortable enough to think about practicalities. He took that as a good sign. He got Dunn stabled and came around to the front door and knocked twice, the pattern he'd told May, 2 knocks short and 1 longer. And after a moment the bar scraped back and the door opened. May stood there, the rifle in her hands, held properly. She looked at him, then past him at the darkening yard, and then stepped back to let him in. The house was warmer than he'd left it. Someone, Eli, he'd learned later, had kept the fire built up through the afternoon. The lamps were lit. The kitchen table had been cleared and wiped down, which he hadn't asked anyone to do. Cobb was asleep near the fire again, curled into the tight sleeping posture of young children. Dara was awake now and sitting up, still pale, but watching the room with alert eyes. Petra was sitting in the corner with what Wyatt recognized as his one and only book, a battered copy of a survey journal from the Western Territories that he kept more out of old habit than any desire to reread it, turning the pages carefully, looking at the maps. Wyatt took off his coat and hat and sat down. "Creel went east," he said to May. "You bought us time." She absorbed this without visible reaction. "How much time?" "Don't know. When he doesn't find anything east, he'll circle back. Could be 2 days, could be less." He set the supplies on the table, sent a wire to Crane. "Don't know when we'll hear back." May nodded. She was still holding the rifle, he noticed. She hadn't put it down since he'd come in. "You can put that down," he said. She looked at it like she'd forgotten it was there. Then she set it carefully against the wall beside the door. In reach, but put down. That evening, after supper, something shifted. He wasn't sure how it started. Maybe it was the warmth, or the fact that for the second night running, no one had come through the door with bad intentions. Or maybe it was just the cumulative weight of 2 days of relative safety beginning to work on people who hadn't experienced it in a long time. But after the dishes were done, the children did them without being asked, which surprised him. Cobb climbed up onto the bench beside Wyatt and looked at the survey journal that Petra had left on the table and said, in his first full sentence since arriving, "What's them squiggly lines?" "Tusakoshamki muskets." "Maps," Wyatt said. "What's a map?" Wyatt glanced at Petra, who had come to hover at the edge of the table, watching with the careful expression she brought to everything. "Want to show him?" he said to her. Petra looked at the book. Then she sat down, opened it to the page she'd been looking at, and without speaking, traced one of the river lines with her finger and looked at Cobb with an expression that said, "This is a river." Cobb studied it. "Where's us?" he asked. Petra pointed to a spot in the upper portion of the map. "How do you know?" Cobb asked. Petra looked at Wyatt. "She knows because of the ridge line," Wyatt said. "See that line there? That's the ridge you walked across to get here. You can use landmarks to figure out where you are." Cobb stared at this information with the expression of someone encountering an idea that was going to require significant processing time. Eli had drifted over during this exchange. He was leaning against the wall with his arms folded, trying to look like he was only half paying attention, but his eyes were on the map. "How do they make them?" he asked. "The maps." "Somebody has to walk the ground first," Wyatt said. "Survey it, measure distances, mark what's there. I did some of that work when I was scouting." He paused. "It's slow work. You miss things. The maps are always a little bit wrong. So you can't trust them completely," Eli said. "You can trust them as a starting point. You just have to know they're not perfect." Eli seemed to think about that for a moment longer than the statement probably warranted. Wyatt had the sense it wasn't entirely about maps. One. It was Rue who broke something open later that night. The twins were sitting together by the fire. They were almost always together, those two, their shoulders touching, communicating in the small private language of children who'd been each other's only constant for a long time. Wyatt was at the table with his coffee and his thoughts, and the house was quiet in the particular way it got when people were tired but not yet ready to give in to it. Then Rue said, to no one in particular, "Our mama used to sing when it rained." The room went still. Not uncomfortably so, just the way rooms go still when something real gets said in them. Sable beside her was looking at the fire. Her jaw worked once, then steadied. "What'd she sing?" Wyatt asked, because it seemed like the thing to ask. Rue looked at him. "I don't remember all of it, just parts, something about coming home." She paused. "She had a good voice. Better than mine." "You can sing," Wyatt said. Rue shrugged, which was not a denial. "You don't have to," he said. "I'm just asking." Another pause. Then, quietly, not quite singing so much as speaking words in a rhythm, Rue said a few lines of something old and simple that he half recognized from his own childhood, some common song that probably every family west of the Missouri had their own version of. Her voice was uncertain and small, and not particularly musical, but she said it like it mattered, and Sable beside her was perfectly still, and when Rue finished, nobody said anything for a moment. "That's a good song," Wyatt said finally. It was inadequate. He said it anyway.
Rue looked at the fire. Sable reached over and took her sister's hand without looking at her. May, from her spot near the window, said nothing. But Wyatt saw her turn her face away for a moment, and when she turned it back, it was composed again in the careful way she carried most things.
The thing with Eli happened on the third day. The boy had been up before dawn. Wyatt heard him moving in the kitchen and came out to find him standing at the window with a cup of water, looking at the yard. Not like he was watching for something, more like he'd been awake for a while and needed somewhere to put his eyes. Wyatt made coffee. Didn't say anything for a while. Just let the fire build and the light come in and the silence sit between them without trying to fill it. Eventually Eli said, "Do you think about them, the people you lost?" Wyatt set his cup down. "Every day," he said. "Does it get—" Eli stopped, started again. "People say it gets easier. I don't know if I believe that." "It doesn't get easier exactly," Wyatt said. "It gets different. The thing that's hard changes shape over time." He paused, looking for the honest version of this and not the comfortable one. "For a while after my family died, the hard thing was mornings. I'd wake up and there'd be a half second where I didn't remember yet. And then I did. And that was the hardest part of every day." Eli was looking at him now. "That part did get better," Wyatt said. "Eventually I just woke up already knowing. Which sounds worse, but it isn't, because it meant I wasn't losing them again every morning." Eli was quiet for a moment. "Who did you lose?" "Wife named Clara. 2 kids. Lena was 7, Ben was 4. He kept his voice even. "Fever came through in the spring. Took a lot of people that year." "I'm sorry," Eli said. "Yeah." Wyatt picked his cup back up. "Me too." The boy was quiet again, then, "The guard I hit at the fence. I keep thinking about whether he had kids, whether somebody's going to feel about him the way you feel about—" He stopped. "That's a hard thing to carry," Wyatt said. "Yeah." "The carrying it, though," Wyatt said carefully, "that's not a punishment. It's just what a conscience does when it's working right." He paused. "You can carry it and still have done the right thing. Those 2 things can both be true at once." Eli looked out the window for a long time. "I wish they couldn't." "I know," Wyatt said. "Me too." May found him in the barn that afternoon, where he was working on a bridle that had needed mending for going on 2 months. She came in without announcing herself and sat on the low stool he kept near the work table and watched him work for a while. "Eli seems better today," she said. "Little bit," Wyatt agreed. "What'd you say to him?" "Nothing that solved anything, just talked." May considered this. She picked up a loose ring of leather from the table and turned it in her hands, not really looking at it. "He's been carrying that thing about the guard since the second night we were in the cabin," she said. "Wouldn't tell me what was wrong, just went quiet." "He told you eventually." "He told you," she said. "He doesn't—" She stopped, tried again. "With me, he still thinks he has to be okay, because I'm the one who makes the plans, and if I look worried, he worries more." "That's a lot of weight for you," Wyatt said. She looked up at him. "It's fine." "I didn't say it wasn't. I just said it was a lot." She set the leather ring back on the table. "When we were at the camp," she said, after a moment, "the thing that kept me going was having something to do. If I was planning something, even just in my head, just working out how something could be done, I didn't think about the rest of it." She paused. "Is that bad?" Wyatt put down the bridle. "No," he said. "That's just how you're built. Some people feel their way through things. Some people think their way through. Doesn't make one better than the other." "I think Eli feels his way," she said. "I think so too." "I don't know how to help with that." "You already do," Wyatt said. "You kept him alive and got him here. The rest of it he's got to work out for himself. You can't feel things for other people, May. You can only stay close enough that they're not doing it alone." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up again. Not a storm, just the regular cold of the high country. And the barn creaked in it. Wyatt's horse moved in his stall, a soft shuffling sound. "My mama used to say something like that," May said quietly. Not like she was making a comparison, just like the thought arrived. He didn't push on it. "She sounds like a smart woman," he said. "She was." A pause. "She just had bad luck with money." Wyatt picked up the bridle again. They sat in companionable quiet for a while,
Him working, her watching, the barn holding them in from the cold outside. On the fourth day, Petra spoke to him. He'd been outside splitting wood in the cold, something he did more for the physical work of it than out of any great need, since the woodpile was already more than adequate, when he heard the back door of the house open. He looked up, and Petra was standing there in her coat, which was barely a coat, watching him. He kept splitting. After a moment, she came across the yard and stood near the chopping block, her hands in her pockets, and watched him work. He didn't say anything. He'd learned over the past few days that Petra communicated on her own schedule. After about 10 minutes, she said, "Can I try?" He looked at her. She was 9, slight, with small hands. He looked at the axe, which was not a small axe. "Here," he said, and traded the axe for a smaller hatchet he used for kindling. He set a thin piece of pine on the block and stepped back. She studied the setup for a moment. Then she swung, not with much force but with decent aim, and the pine split mostly where it should have. She looked at the result, and then at Wyatt. "Not bad," he said. "Keep your wrist straight." She tried 3 more pieces. The third one split clean. She looked at it with the quiet, contained satisfaction of someone who didn't celebrate things out loud, but noticed when they went right. "Why don't you talk much?" Wyatt asked. He asked it the same way he'd ask about anything else. Not softly, not with the particular careful voice adults used on children they thought were fragile. She thought about it. "At the camp," she said, "talking made things worse. If you said you were hungry, they laughed at you. If you said you were tired, they made you work more." She paused. After a while, it seemed easier not to say things. "Makes sense," Wyatt said. "Is it strange that I don't talk much?" "Not particularly," he said. "I don't talk much either." She seemed to think about that. "You talk to May," she said. "May asks questions," he said. "Hard not to answer." Something that was almost a smile moved across Petra's face and then was gone. She picked up the hatchet again and went back to the kindling without further comment. It was on the 5th evening that the scout arrived. Wyatt saw the rider from the window, a lone figure coming down off the northern ridge at a careful pace, picking his way through the snow. Too cautious to be Blackthorn's people, who tended toward the aggressive and direct. Too deliberate to be lost. He watched for a moment and then said quietly, "May," and she was at his shoulder in seconds, and they watched together as the rider came closer. "One man," May said. "One man," Wyatt agreed. "Is that good or bad?" "Depends on the man." The rider came to the gate and stopped there, didn't push through, just sat his horse and waited. That was something. Men with bad intentions didn't generally wait at gates. Wyatt went out, rifle in hand. He stopped on the porch. "Who are you?" he called. "Name's Garrett Holt," the rider called back. "I ride for Aldous Crane. He got your wire." Wyatt lowered the rifle slightly. "Crane send you ahead?" "He sent me to tell you he's 2 days out. Had a situation at Mineral Fork he had to finish, but he's coming." A pause. "He also said to tell you that Blackthorn's man Creel turned back west yesterday. Marshal Crane ran into him on the road and had a conversation with him about the limits of his authority." "What kind of conversation?" "The kind where Crane had a badge and Creel didn't." Holt's voice was dry. "Creel's gone back to report, which means Blackthorn knows you've got the children and he knows the law's coming. He's going to move fast now." "How fast?" "Fast enough that 2 days might not be comfortable." Wyatt absorbed this. He looked back at the house for a moment, the lamplight in the window, the shapes moving inside. Then he looked at Garrett Holt, sitting patient at the gate in the cold. "Right in," he said. "We'll figure out the next part over supper." He turned back to the house, and through the window he could see May already moving. Not panicking, not frozen. Moving the way she always moved when there was something to plan. With focus, with her chin up, with that particular stubborn set to her jaw that he was starting to recognize as the shape a person's courage took when it had been tested enough times to find its true form. He went back inside. They had 2 days, maybe less. And Blackthorn for the first time knew exactly where they were. Garrett Holt was not what Wyatt had expected from a man who rode for Aldous Crane. He was younger than his voice suggested, maybe 26, 27, with a lean, weathered face that had seen more hard weather than his years entirely accounted for. He ate supper at the table without making a production of it, answered direct questions with direct answers,
and had the particular quality of a man who'd learned early that silence was often more useful than talking. Wyatt respected that. He'd learned the same thing, just later. The children watched Holt with the calibrated wariness they brought to all new arrivals, but May in particular tracked him through supper with those careful dark eyes, measuring something. "How many men does Blackthorn typically move with?" she asked him, partway through the meal. Holt looked at her, a brief, adjusting look, the kind a grown man gives when a child asks a question more precise than he was expecting. "Depends on what he's doing," he said. "If it's business, 2 or 3. If he's making a point, more." "He'll be making a point," May said. "He doesn't like being embarrassed." "No," Holt agreed. "He doesn't." "So more," she said. "Most likely." She looked at Wyatt. He looked back at her. They'd already had the version of this conversation that mattered out in the barn the previous afternoon, and they'd both arrived at the same place. Running wasn't the answer. The ranch had walls, a defensible approach from the north, and a water supply that wouldn't freeze out for another week at least. Those were advantages. Open country gave them nothing. After Holt finished eating, Wyatt took him outside to look at the layout, the approach roads, the sight lines from the windows, the barn, and what it offered in terms of cover. Holt walked it with the careful attention of a man accustomed to reading ground. He didn't say much while he was doing it. When they got back to the porch, he stood and looked north for a moment. 2 days, you said, Wyatt said. Crane will push it if he can, but 2 days is what I'd planned for. A pause. You got ammunition? Enough for what I'm hoping this is, Wyatt said. Not enough for what I'm afraid it might be. Holt looked at him. I've got extra, he said. Crane sent me with it. He's done this before. Getting somewhere before the situation goes wrong. And he knows what to bring. Wyatt nodded. He was thinking about the children, about where to put them if it came to a fight, about the layout of the back room and the root cellar beneath the kitchen floor. He was also thinking about the fact that he was one man, and Holt was one more, and Blackthorn could conceivably show up with 10. You scared? Holt asked. Not unkindly, just asking. Reasonably, Wyatt said. Good, Holt said. Unreasonable people tend to get shot sooner. Done. They came on the morning of the second day. It was just after dawn, the light still thin and gray, when Wyatt heard Dunn moving in the barn, not the restless shuffling of a horse that wanted out, but the specific agitated movement of an animal that had scented something wrong on the wind. He was out of his chair before he'd fully decided to be, crossing to the window and looking north. 7 riders, coming down off the ridge in a loose line, moving with the deliberate, unhurried pace of men who weren't expecting resistance, or weren't worried about it if they found any. At the front of the line was a man on a heavy black horse, dressed better than the rest, his coat dark and well cut even at this distance. He rode like a man who was accustomed to arriving places and having the situation arrange itself around him. Beside Wyatt, May said, That's him. She'd appeared without sound, as she tended to do, and was standing at the edge of the window frame with her back flat to the wall. Staying out of the line of sight from outside, Wyatt noticed. She'd figured that out herself. You're sure? He asked. I know the horse, she said. He never rode anything else on camp inspections. Wyatt turned from the window. Holt, he said. Holt was already up from his bedroll, already moving to the east window. I see them, he said. 7. I count 7, yes. Wyatt looked at the children. They were awake, all of them, some sitting up, some standing, all very still with the particular quality of people who knew what the sound of horses at dawn could mean. Cobb had moved to May's side without being asked and was standing against her leg. She put her hand on his shoulder without looking down. Okay, Wyatt said, keeping his voice even. Here's what we're doing. Eli, I need you to take the little ones, Cobb, Dara, Rue, Sable, into the root cellar. Trap doors under the kitchen table. You've seen it. Eli nodded. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were steady. May, Petra, you're staying up. Petra, you know where the extra rifle is. Petra looked at him and nodded once. May. He looked at her directly. You stay back from the windows. You hear me? You stay back. She looked like she wanted to argue. She didn't. I'm going to go out and talk to him, Wyatt said. Most of this is probably going to be legal threats and money offers. Blackthorn didn't get where he is by burning things down before he tried buying them first. Holt, You cover me from the east window. Don't fire unless I fire first or something goes wrong that leaves no other option." "Understood," Holt said. "What counts as something going wrong?" May asked. "You'll know," Wyatt said. He pulled on his coat, took his rifle, and went out the front door. Edgar Blackthorne stopped his horse about 30 feet from the porch. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, heavy without being fat, somewhere in his 50s, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had hardened into something more authoritative than attractive. He had pale eyes that moved with the slow, assessing quality of a man who had learned to look at everything in terms of what it was worth. He looked at Wyatt the same way. "Mercer," he said. His voice was deep, unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once in his adult life needed to raise it to be heard. "Blackthorne," Wyatt said. "You've got something of mine." "I've got 6 children," Wyatt said, which isn't the same thing. Blackthorne's expression didn't change appreciably. "Those children are contracted workers. I have legal documentation." He half turned, and one of the riders behind him produced a leather satchel and brought it forward. "Binding agreements, signed in each case, establishing the terms of labor and residency. What you've done here is theft of contracted labor, which is actionable under territorial law." "I'd like to see those contracts," Wyatt said. "You're welcome to." Blackthorne nodded at the rider, who dismounted and brought the satchel to the edge of the porch. Wyatt came down the steps and took it without breaking eye contact with Blackthorne, then opened it. He looked at the documents inside. They were official-looking, yes. Stamped and signed and organized with the care of paperwork prepared by people who knew exactly how paperwork was used as a weapon. He looked at the names he recognized now, names belonging to children who were currently in a root cellar under his kitchen floor, and at the terms, which were written in the dense legal language designed to sound binding to someone who didn't read it carefully. He read it carefully. "These contracts were signed on behalf of children between the ages of 4 and 10, he said, by parents or guardians who are not present to verify the terms were explained to them. And the terms themselves," he looked up. "This isn't a labor contract, Blackthorne. It's an ownership document. The courts have consistently—" "I'm not interested in what your courts have said," Wyatt said. "I'm telling you what this document says." He closed the satchel and held it out to the rider. "And I'm telling you that none of these children are leaving this property with you." Blackthorne looked at him for a long moment, the pale eyes calculated. "I'm prepared to offer you a settlement," he said, "for the inconvenience. $500. You release the children into my custody, and we forget this happened." "No. 1,000 then." "No." The silence stretched. One of the riders behind Blackthorne shifted in his saddle. Another one, Wyatt had been keeping track of all of them with the peripheral attention of a trained scout, moved his horse about 3 feet to the left, which put him at a different angle to the porch. Wyatt noticed it. "Mr. Mercer," Blackthorne said, and his voice had changed slightly. Not louder, but with a different quality underneath it, something that was almost conversational and wasn't. "I have operated in this territory for 11 years. I have faced 14 legal challenges to my business practices. I have won every one of them. The judges in this district know my name, and they know what I contribute to this region's economy. What you're proposing to do, making an enemy of me over 6 children who cost you nothing and will cost you considerably, is a decision you will not recover from." "You might be right about that," Wyatt said. "I am right about it." "Then I guess we disagree about whether it matters," Wyatt said. Blackthorne stared at him. Wyatt had the sense this was not a response the man had encountered frequently. The calculation behind those pale eyes shifted, recalibrated, arrived somewhere new. He raised his hand. The rider who'd moved 3 feet to the left brought his rifle up. The first shot came from somewhere Wyatt hadn't expected. Not the rider with the rifle, but one of the men farther back. And it went wide, splintering the porch post 2 feet to Wyatt's left. He was already moving, already off the porch steps and using the steps themselves for cover, and he heard the crack of Holt's rifle from the east window a half-second later, and one of the rider's horses screamed and wheeled. What followed was not a clean fight. It was never a clean fight, Wyatt knew. The way movies and stories made gunfights into something sequential and logical was not how it actually happened. What actually happened was noise and motion and the particular tunnel narrowing of the world that happened when someone was trying to kill you, and in that state you didn't think so much as move. He took the man with the rifle first. A shot from around the corner of the porch steps, not clean but sufficient, hitting the man in the shoulder and taking him out of the engagement. He moved low along the front of the house, keeping the porch between himself and the center of the group, and got to the corner of the building before another 2 shots came in, both hitting the wall above where he'd been. Holt was working the east window steadily, not rapidly, measured, aimed fire, the kind a man used when he knew he had a limited number of shots and needed each one to count. One of the riders was down from his horse. 2 more had dismounted and were using their horses for cover, which was smart, but also meant the horses were scared and moving, which worked against them. Blackthorn himself had pulled back. Wyatt caught a glimpse of him behind the line of riders, still mounted, watching, his expression doing something that was hard to read at distance. Not afraid exactly. Recalculating, maybe. He was not the kind of man who put himself in the line of fire personally. He had people for that. There was a pause, the particular held breath pause that happened in firefights when both sides were behind cover and neither wanted to be the next to move. Wyatt used it. He counted riders. He could account for 5 of the 7. 2 were unaccounted for, and he'd learned in 11 years of scouting that the riders you couldn't account for were the ones that would kill you. He looked at the barn. The barn door was slightly open. It hadn't been open when he'd come out this morning. "Holt!" he called. "I see it," Holt called back. The barn door opened another foot. Someone was inside. The house. The root cellar. The children. If someone was in the barn, they weren't there to take the horse. Wyatt didn't think about it. He ran. He went across the open ground between the house and the barn at a dead sprint, which was a profoundly stupid thing to do under fire, and he took a shot from behind him that he felt go past him in the air. Close, very close. And then he hit the barn wall and pressed himself against it, his heart doing something violent in his chest, and reached for the door. He pulled it open and went in fast and low. The barn interior was dim, hay-smelling, cold. He heard movement in the back, near the rear access door that connected to the root cellar access passage he'd dug 2 summers ago as a secondary exit during a spring when mountain lions had been a problem and he'd wanted an escape route. He'd forgotten, until this moment, that the passage existed, that May and the others probably didn't know about it. He moved through the barn, his eyes adjusted. He caught a shape, a man, one of the riders, moving along the rear wall toward the passage door, carrying a lantern that wasn't lit yet. "Stop," Wyatt said. The man turned. He was big, heavier than Wyatt, with the blank-focused expression of someone who'd been given a job and didn't think about it beyond the job. He had a pistol in his free hand and he raised it. Wyatt fired. The shot hit the man in the upper leg and he went down hard, the lantern dropping and cracking on the barn floor, oil spreading but not igniting because it was too cold and too damp in here, and luck sometimes worked that way. The man was down but not finished. He was swearing, reaching for the pistol he'd dropped, scrabbling for it on the barn floor. Wyatt crossed the barn in 4 strides and kicked the pistol away. Then he stood over the man and looked at him, breathing hard, and said, "Put your hands where I can see them." The man, in the grip of the particular clarity that comes from being shot, complied. The fighting outside had slowed by the time Wyatt came back around the front of the barn. 2 of Blackthorn's riders were completely down. 2 more were holding positions behind their horses but not firing, either out of ammunition or reevaluating the math of the situation. The man Wyatt had left in the barn was going to need a doctor, and he'd live long enough to get one. The man who'd fired at Wyatt from the left side of the porch was sitting in the snow with his hand pressed to his shoulder, also not going anywhere fast. Blackthorn was still mounted. He was watching Wyatt walk back toward the house with an expression that had gone somewhere colder than it had been before. Not rage, which Wyatt might have expected, but something more deliberate. The look of a man revising his approach, not abandoning it. "You've assaulted my employees," Blackthorn said. "Your employees broke into my barn," Wyatt said. He stopped at the edge of the porch. "While your other employees were shooting at my house." "This isn't finished," Blackthorn said. "No," Wyatt agreed. "It isn't." He could see something shifting in the way the 2 mounted riders behind Blackthorn were sitting. Not the change of men about to do something. More the change of men recalculating whether what they'd signed on for was worth what it was turning into. Hired work was one thing. Getting shot for a man's business dispute was another. Holt's voice came from the east window. "Riders coming, North Road." Wyatt kept his eyes on Blackthorn. "How many?" A pause. "4. Badge on the lead horse." Blackthorn heard it. Something moved in his face, not quite fear, but its practical cousin. He looked north, toward the ridge, toward the approaching sound of horses. Then he looked back at Wyatt, and the calculation in his pale eyes was doing something fast and complicated. "This doesn't end here," Blackthorn said. "You've said that," Wyatt said. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Blackthorn turned his horse, said something quiet to his remaining riders, and began moving north and east, not retreating at a run, not abandoning his wounded, but angling away from the direction of the incoming riders with the particular efficiency of a man who knew when a tactical withdrawal was the smart move and had no personal feelings about doing it. 2 of his riders went with him. 1 stayed behind to help the man in the snow. 1 more went to the barn, which was Wyatt's acknowledgement that Blackthorn had some minimal instinct for his own people. He let them go. He stood on the porch until the sound of their horses faded. Then he sat down on the porch steps, because his legs were suggesting it, and put his rifle across his knees and breathed. The front door opened behind him. May was there. She'd been standing inside at the window. He could tell by the angle she'd have had on things. She came out and stood behind him and looked north at the diminishing shapes. "You ran across the open yard," she said. "Yes." "That was dangerous." "Yes." "Someone was in the barn," she said. It wasn't a question. "One of his men, using the back passage to get to the cellar." He looked up at her. "You didn't know about the back passage?" "No," she said. There was something in her voice, a very controlled version of the thing that might have been fear, processed into after-the-fact information. "We wouldn't have known." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry, I should have told you." She was quiet a moment, then she said, with characteristic directness, "The next time you take us somewhere, you tell us all the ways in and out." "Agreed," he said. Marshal Aldous Crane was exactly what a man named Aldous Crane should look like, which was to say, he looked like the kind of person who'd been told since birth that he was built for a particular kind of work and had never seen any reason to argue. He was 60, compact, with a white mustache, and eyes the color of creek water in winter. Gray-blue, clear, very direct. He moved like a much younger man, and spoke like a man who'd learned that most things worth saying could be said in fewer words than people generally used. He came into the yard with 3 deputies and looked at the evidence of the fight, the marks in the snow, the blood, the cracked barn door, and said to Wyatt, "You holding up?" "Well enough," Wyatt said. "Anyone hurt? Inside?" "No. The children are fine." Something crossed Crane's face briefly. Relief, maybe, or something close to it. "Good." He looked north. "He went east?" "Northeast. Toward the river crossing, probably." Crane nodded. He turned to one of his deputies, a compact young woman with a rifle that she carried like she'd grown up with one in her hands, and said something Wyatt couldn't hear. She nodded and rode out. "I can get him tonight," Crane said. "He's got wounded to deal with. He'll have to stop somewhere." He paused. "Or he'll run back to the county seat and try to do this through lawyers, which is probably what he should have done in the first place." "He tried lawyers first," Wyatt said. "He brought contracts." "Of course he did." Crane's expression was dry. "He always does. Doesn't make them legal, just makes them look that way." He looked at the house. "Can I speak to the children?" "You can try," Wyatt said. "They'll decide for themselves." Crane almost smiled at that. "Fair enough," he said. May decided. She came to the front room and looked at Crane with the same careful measuring assessment she gave every new person, and Crane sat in the chair across from her and didn't make any of the usual adjustments that adults made when talking to children. Didn't lean forward too eagerly or speak too gently or look at her with the particular kind of pity that May, Wyatt suspected, found more offensive than hostility. "I need to understand what happened at the Blackthorn operation," Crane said. "What you saw, what you can testify to." "Not now. When you're ready, in a proper setting. But I need to know if you're willing." May looked at him for a long moment. What happens to Blackthorn if we testify? If your testimony and the testimony of the others holds up, and if we can verify it with other evidence, he faces criminal charges, potentially significant ones. Potentially, she said. I won't promise you outcomes I can't guarantee, Crane said. He has resources. He'll fight it. But I'll tell you that I've been building a case against Edgar Blackthorn for 2 years, and what you and these children know is more than I've gotten from any other source. May was quiet for a moment. Then, what about while this is happening? While the case is being built and he's still out there? Crane looked at Wyatt. Wyatt had been standing at the edge of the room, not part of the conversation, but close enough to be in it. The look Crane gave him was a question. They stay here, Wyatt said, with me, for as long as it takes. Crane looked back at May. May looked at Wyatt with an expression that he was getting better at reading, the one that wasn't quite trust yet but was deciding whether to become it. The little ones too, she said. All of you, Wyatt said. She turned back to Crane. Then yes, she said. We'll testify. The afternoon wound down slow and cold. Crane's deputies set up a perimeter, which, on a working ranch in the middle of winter, looked less like military presence and more like 3 people who were very good at knowing where they were at all times. Crane himself settled at the kitchen table with a notebook and began the careful, unhurried work of taking preliminary statements, starting with May, then Eli, then working through the others in order of age and willingness. Wyatt stayed out of it mostly. He fixed the porch post that had been splintered by the first shot. He repaired the barn door. He found the lantern the man had dropped in the barn and cleaned up the oil before it could freeze into a mess. And then he stood for a moment in the quiet of the barn and let himself feel the particular exhaustion of a day that had asked more of him than he'd expected. His hands were steady. They'd been steady through all of it, which he'd learned long ago was how his body worked under pressure. It saved the shaking for afterward, when there was room for it. He let himself shake for a minute or two, alone in the barn. Then he put it away and went back to the house. Eli was sitting on the porch when he came around the corner. Not inside, not out in the yard, just on the steps, in the cold, looking at nothing. Wyatt sat down beside him. How'd it go? Wyatt asked. With Crane. He's good at asking things, Eli said. Doesn't make you feel like you're on trial. He's had a lot of practice. Eli was quiet. I told him everything, he said after a moment, including, he paused, the guard, at the fence. Wyatt looked at him. He said it was likely to be ruled self-defense given the circumstances, Eli said. His voice was flat, carrying the information without quite yet knowing what to do with it. He said the law sees a difference between what I did and what Blackthorn's people did. That's true, Wyatt said. It still happened, Eli said. It still happened, Wyatt agreed. He didn't try to argue that away. They sat in the cold for another minute. Above the ridge to the north, the sky was going the particular deep orange of a frontier sunset, brilliant and brief, the kind of thing that happened out here in winter that made the season almost worth it for a moment. Wyatt, Eli said. Yeah. After all this is done, he stopped, started again. Do you think a person can be okay after things like this? Wyatt thought about Clara, about Lena and Ben, about the first winter alone on this ranch, when okay had seemed like the most remote thing imaginable. I think okay changes shape, he said finally. I don't think you get the old version of it back, but I think you find a version that fits the person you become. He paused. It takes longer than people tell you, and it's not straight. But yeah, I think so. Eli absorbed this. He pulled his coat tighter around him against the cold. Okay, he said. Not about Wyatt's answer exactly. Just, okay. Like he was accepting a weight he'd decided he could carry. Inside the house, through the window, Wyatt could hear Crane's quiet voice still working through someone's statement, and beyond it, the lower sounds of the house. Cobb's voice asking something, Rue's answer, the small ordinary sounds of children who had, for the first time in a long time, no immediate reason to be afraid. Outside, the orange faded from the sky and the first stars showed up, faint and cold, and very far away. Blackthorn was still out there, somewhere in the dark beyond the ridge, wounded, retreated, but not finished. Wyatt had no illusions about that. The man had said it twice, and he'd meant it both times. But Crane was here. and the children had agreed to speak. And tomorrow would begin something harder and slower than a gunfight, which was the kind of battle that a man like Blackthorne was more accustomed to winning. That, Wyatt thought, was going to have to change. The county seat of Delworth was not an impressive place. It had a main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass each other without courtesy, a courthouse that had been built with ambitions the town hadn't quite grown into yet, 3 saloons, a telegraph office, a bank that had survived 2 attempted robberies and 1 actual one, and the general atmosphere of a place that was trying to become something without being entirely sure what. Wyatt had been through it a handful of times over the years and had never had strong feelings about it in either direction. It was a town. It had what towns had. He had strong feelings about it now, because this was where it was going to be decided. They arrived on a Tuesday, the 2nd week of February, in 2 wagons that Crane had arranged. The children bundled under every blanket Wyatt owned, plus several that Crane's office had produced from somewhere. The cold still sharp enough to make breath visible, but the roads passable after a week of clear weather following the storm. Wyatt rode beside the lead wagon. Holt rode on the other side. Crane was already in Delworth, had been for 3 days, doing the preliminary legal work that Wyatt didn't fully understand but had learned to trust. May sat in the back of the lead wagon with Dara tucked against her side and her eyes on the road ahead. She'd been quiet for most of the 2-day journey, not the frightened quiet of the cabin, not the watchful quiet of the early days at the ranch, but something more internal, working something out. On the first night's camp, when the younger children were asleep and Eli had taken the first watch at Crane's instruction, she'd come and sat by the fire across from Wyatt and said, "Tell me about the courthouse." He told her what he knew, the layout, the procedure, what a territorial court hearing looked like, what the judge would likely ask, what Blackthorne's lawyers would try to do. He didn't soften any of it. She didn't ask him to. "They'll try to make us look unreliable," she said, "because we're children." "They'll try," he said. "Crane knows that. He's prepared for it." "What does prepared look like?" "It looks like making sure your testimony is specific. Dates, details, things that can be checked against records. Things that are hard to argue with because they're concrete." He paused. "Crane told me that the single most powerful thing a witness can do is say exactly what they saw, without adding to it or pulling back from it. Not what they think, not what they felt, just what they saw." May considered that for a long moment. "What they saw is bad enough," she said. "I know," he said. "Eli saw more than I did. Some of it. I know that too." She looked at the fire. "He'll do it," she said. "He's scared, but he'll do it." "I believe you," Wyatt said. She was quiet for a moment longer, then she said, in a voice that was slightly different from her usual flat directness, slightly younger somehow, "What if it doesn't work?" It was the first time she'd asked him something like that. The first time she'd let the calculation drop enough to show what was underneath it. "Then we figure out the next thing," Wyatt said. "But May, I've watched Crane work for 3 days now. He's not a man who goes into a room without knowing what he's walking into. And what he's walking into here is more than he had a week ago." She looked at him. "Because of us. Because of you," he said. "All of you." She turned back to the fire. She didn't say anything else, but the particular set of her shoulders shifted slightly. Not relaxed exactly, but squared in a different way. The way a person squared themselves when they'd made a decision and were done revisiting it. Missed. Crane met them at the edge of town with news that changed the shape of the next several days in ways Wyatt hadn't anticipated. He pulled Wyatt aside while Holt got the wagons to the boarding house Crane had arranged. A solid, clean establishment run by a woman named Mrs. Ferris, who had been briefed on the situation and had the brisk, unflappable quality of someone who'd raised several children of her own and was not going to be startled by 6 more. "We have a development," Crane said. He said it without preamble, which was his style, but there was something underneath the words that Wyatt recognized as controlled excitement, the expression of a man who'd been working a very long trail and had just found the sign he was looking for. "What kind of development?" "The kind that comes with a name," Crane said. "Thomas Voss." Wyatt didn't recognize it. "Who's that?" "Edgar Blackthorne's nephew," Crane said. "His sister's son. Worked in the accounting office of the Harrow River operation for 3 years. He paused. Walked into my office 2 days ago and sat down and told me he wanted to make a statement. Wyatt absorbed this. Why? The short version is that Voss is 24 years old and has been keeping records for 2 years that he was never officially asked to keep because he understood what he was seeing and he couldn't figure out what to do about it until now. Crane's voice was measured, but the thing underneath it was still there. The restrained energy of a man who'd waited a long time for something and was trying not to appear too hungry about it. He's got ledger books, Wyatt, transaction records, payments to 3 judges in this district, 2 county officials, 4 members of the territorial legislature. Records of labor procurement that describe, in the plain, factual language of accounting, exactly what was happening at those camps. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Does Blackthorne know? I don't believe so. Voss came to me quietly, through a third party. He's been staying at a private address since he arrived. Crane paused. He's frightened. He has reason to be. But he's also determined, which is the more useful quality at the moment. What does he want? Immunity from prosecution for his role as an accessory, protection during the proceedings, and, Crane almost smiled, which was something Wyatt had only seen once before from the man, and a chance to say something in open court. He was specific about that. He wants to say it in public. Will the court grant immunity? I've already begun that process. The judge who's been assigned to this case is Honorine Sattler. She's from the Eastern Districts originally, appointed 8 months ago, and she is, significantly, not on Blackthorne's list of paid officials. Wyatt felt something shift slightly in the way the week ahead looked to him. Not confidence, exactly. He'd lived long enough to know that things that looked good from a distance had a way of getting complicated up close. But something. When's the hearing? He asked. Thursday, Crane said. 2 days. The night before the hearing, Wyatt found it difficult to sleep in the way that had nothing to do with noise or discomfort, and everything to do with the particular restlessness of a mind that wouldn't let itself stop moving. He lay in the dark of the small room at Mrs. Ferris's boarding house and looked at the ceiling and went over the same ground he'd already covered a dozen times, looking for what he'd missed, what he hadn't prepared for, what could go wrong. He got up around midnight and went downstairs and sat at the kitchen table. He wasn't alone. Eli was already there. The boy was sitting in the same spot he always seemed to find in any kitchen, the one with the best view of the door, with a cup of cold water and the map from Wyatt's survey journal, which he'd apparently brought along in his pack and was now studying in the low lantern light. He looked up when Wyatt came in. Couldn't sleep, Eli said. No, Wyatt agreed. He poured himself water from the pitcher on the counter and sat down. You ready for tomorrow? Eli considered the question with the seriousness he brought to most things. Crane went over it with me 4 times, he said. I know what to say. That's not what I asked. Eli looked at the map. I keep thinking about what their lawyer is going to say. Crane told me they'll try to say we made things up, or that we misunderstood what was happening. They will say that, Wyatt said. How do you answer something like that? When somebody tells you that you didn't see what you saw? Wyatt thought about that carefully because it deserved a careful answer. You tell the truth, he said finally. Exactly what you saw, exactly when you saw it, with as much detail as you can carry. You don't argue with their interpretation. That's Crane's job. Your job is just to say what happened. He paused. The truth is the most specific thing there is. A lie has to be general to survive. The truth can afford to be exact. Eli sat with that for a moment. May said something like that once, he said. Different words. She's a smart person. Yeah. A pause. She doesn't show it when she's scared, but she was scared last night. I could tell. How? She was too still, Eli said. When May's calm for real, she still moves a little, and she's always thinking about something. When she goes completely still, she's scared and trying not to show it. Wyatt thought about that. I didn't know that about her, he said. I've known her for 2 years, Eli said. There was something in his voice that was quiet and matter-of-fact and very honest. The voice of someone describing a thing they knew the way they knew their own hands. She kept us alive when I didn't think we were going to make it. There were 3 times at the camp that she figured a way through something that I couldn't see. He stopped. She's 8, he said, like he was still a little surprised by it.
She's 8, Wyatt agreed.
That's not right, Eli said.
That she had to be that.
No, Wyatt said. It isn't. They sat in the quiet kitchen for a while without talking, the lantern burning low between them, the night outside the window deep and still. Eventually, Eli folded the map and said goodnight and went back upstairs. Wyatt sat alone for a while longer, and then he went back upstairs too and slept a few hours before the morning came. The courthouse was full. That was the first thing Wyatt noticed when they arrived, that more people had come than he'd expected, filling the benches in the gallery with the particular mix of types that showed up when a powerful man's power was publicly contested. Some were there out of genuine interest in justice. Some were there because Edgar Blackthorne had affected their lives in ways they'd never had the ability to address until now. And some were simply there because it was the most interesting thing happening in Delworth that week. Human nature didn't clean itself up for important occasions. Blackthorne was already present, seated at the defendant's table with 2 lawyers and the particular bearing of a man who had decided that the appropriate response to public scrutiny was to look like he found it mildly boring. He was dressed well, better than anyone else in the room. His lawyers had the polished, unhurried quality of men who were paid enough to be confident regardless of the facts. He looked at the children when they came in. His eyes moved across them. May, Eli, the others. And it was the same look Wyatt had seen on the porch of his ranch, calculating, assessing value. The look of a man who had spent so long thinking of other people as resources that he'd lost, or perhaps never had, the capacity to look at them any other way. May looked back at him. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked away. Not in retreat, but with the deliberate quality of someone who'd finished checking something and found nothing there worth continuing to examine. Wyatt sat in the first row of the gallery, directly behind Crane's table. Mrs. Ferris had taken the younger children, Cobb, Dara, Rue, Sable, back to the boarding house for the morning. Crane had decided their testimony, if needed, could wait. The primary witnesses for the first session were May, Eli, and Petra, who had surprised everyone, including Wyatt, by stating calmly the previous evening that she wanted to speak. Judge Honorine Sattler arrived without ceremony and sat without ceremony and looked at the room with the expression of a person who had seen many rooms like this one and had no patience for anything that wasted her time. She was perhaps 50, spare in her movements, with the kind of face that had settled into itself so completely it was impossible to imagine it ever having been uncertain. "This court is in session," she said. "We're here to consider allegations of unlawful labor procurement, illegal detention of minors, fraud, and related charges against Edgar Blackthorne of the Harrow River, Blackthorne Mining and Land Company. We will proceed with witness examination." She looked at Crane. "Mr. Crane, you may call your first witness." Crane stood. "The Territorial Authority calls May Hollow." May walked to the witness stand the same way she walked everywhere. Straight spine, chin level, eyes forward. She was wearing the best dress Mrs. Ferris had been able to find for her in 2 days, which was a dark blue wool that was slightly too large in the shoulders. She sat in the chair and put her hands in her lap and looked at Crane. She was 8 years old, and she looked like she was about 40. Crane took her through it carefully, methodically. He told Wyatt his approach beforehand. Start with the facts that could be independently verified. Build the picture piece by piece. Let the accumulation of specific detail do the work. He asked May about her arrival at the Blackthorne camp. The date, the circumstances, the man who had come to her mother with the papers. He asked about the work, what she was required to do, the hours, the conditions. He asked about the food, about the sleeping arrangements, about the guard structure. May answered each question with the same flat precision she brought to everything. She didn't embellish. She didn't editorialize. She said what she'd seen, as Wyatt had told her, with the exactness of a person who had been paying careful attention because her life depended on it. The room was very quiet. Blackthorne's lead lawyer, a man named Fitch, silver-haired and smoothly competent, cross-examined with the particular technique of someone trying to introduce doubt through complexity rather than contradiction. He asked about May's age at the time of various events. He asked whether she might have misunderstood the nature of the arrangement. He used words like voluntary and agreement and compensation in ways that were technically accurate and entirely misleading. May dealt with it in a way that Wyatt hadn't quite anticipated. She didn't get rattled. She didn't get defensive. She just waited for each question to finish and then answered it as precisely as she'd answered Crane's questions. And when Fitch tried to characterize something she'd said in a way that wasn't accurate, she said, simply, and without any particular heat, "That's not what I said." Fitch looked at her. "I'm paraphrasing." "I know what you're doing," May said, and her voice was 8 years old and completely level. "You're trying to make it sound like I chose to be there. I was 5 years old when I arrived. I didn't choose anything. I'm telling you what happened, and what happened is what I said." The room shifted. It was a subtle thing, the way the quality of attention in a room could change. But Wyatt felt it, and from the slight adjustment in Fitch's posture, Fitch felt it too. Judge Sattler was looking at May with an expression that was very still and very attentive. Fitch retreated to the procedural approach for the rest of the cross-examination, which was what Crane had predicted he would do when the direct attack didn't work. Technical questions about dates and details, trying to find inconsistencies in the edges. He found very few because May had been paying attention for 3 years and had a memory for detail that was close to extraordinary. When Fitch finally said he had no further questions, the exhale from the gallery was audible.
Eli's testimony was harder. Not because he was less prepared or less precise. He was both in his own way. But what Eli had seen was harder. He'd been in the camp longer than May, assigned to the more physical labor, and he'd been older when he arrived, which meant he'd understood more of what was happening in real time and had carried the understanding of it for longer.
He spoke about the boy who had died in the second winter, a child named Ferris, no relation to the boarding house proprietress, who had been 8 years old and had gotten sick and had not been given the care that might have saved him. He spoke about it the way you spoke about something you'd witnessed and never been able to unfamilo. Not dramatically, not with tears, just with the flat devastation of a fact that had set itself permanently in your memory. Fitch did not cross-examine Eli as aggressively as he had May. Wyatt wasn't entirely sure whether this was legal strategy or something more human. Petra spoke last. She came to the stand and sat down and folded her hands in her lap and looked at Crane. And Crane said, "In your own time." And she spoke for 15 minutes without stopping. It was the most Wyatt had ever heard her say. It was the most anyone in that room had probably ever heard her say. She spoke in the same quiet voice she used for everything, measured, unhurried, and she described with complete clarity specific incidents spanning 2 years at the camp. She named names. She gave dates. She described the structure of the operation with the organizational clarity of someone who had been paying closer attention than anyone had realized. When she finished, the room was silent in a way that courtrooms didn't usually go silent. Judge Sattler looked at her for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Thank you, young lady," which was not, Wyatt suspected, something she said often. Nut. Thomas Voss took the stand after the lunch recess. He was a slight young man with his uncle's coloring but none of his bearing. Where Blackthorn was massive and controlled, Voss looked like someone who'd spent 2 years being very careful and was now terrified and relieved in equal measure to be done with the carefulness. He had a leather satchel on his lap, and he held it with both hands. Crane said, "Mr. Voss, you were employed as an accountant for the Blackthorn Mining and Land Company from the year 1879 until recently. Is that correct?" "Yes," Voss said. "In the course of that employment, did you maintain records beyond those officially required by the company?" "Yes." He swallowed. "I started keeping my own copies about 18 months in, of certain—" He paused, and for a moment Wyatt thought the young man was going to lose his nerve, but he didn't. He straightened slightly and said, "Of certain transactions that didn't appear in the official accounts." "What kind of transactions?" Voss opened the satchel. What he produced was not one ledger, but 4. Compact, worn, clearly kept over time. He set them on the stand in front of him with the careful reverence of someone who had been protecting something that cost him a great deal to carry. "These are transaction records," he said, "dating from January of 1879. They document payments made from company funds to specific individuals, in amounts and on schedules that don't correspond to any legitimate business expense." He looked at Crane. "I can identify each recipient." Fitch was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor, this is—" "I'll hear the witness," Sattler said, and her tone made Fitch sit back down. Voss read the names. It took a while because there were more of them than Crane had mentioned to Wyatt. Not 3 judges, but 5. Not 4 officials, but 7. State-level names that Wyatt didn't recognize, but that produced a specific quality of reaction in the gallery, the collective sound of people hearing things they'd suspected but never had confirmed spoken plainly in a room that recorded things. Blackthorn's composure, through all of this, had held. He'd been good at holding it. But when Voss began reading from the 4th ledger, the one that documented, in the blunt language of accounting entries, the procurement costs for what Voss called labor units that were, in the recorded details, clearly children, something changed in Blackthorn's face. The composure didn't crack so much as reveal itself for what it was underneath. A held thing, a controlled thing. And the control was costing him now. He turned to Fitch and said something in a low voice. Fitch nodded and stood and asked for a recess. Sattler denied it. So, Pooh. The afternoon was procedural, dense with the kind of legal maneuvering that Wyatt followed at the surface level only. Fitch mounted a vigorous and technically sophisticated challenge to the admissibility of Voss's records, which Sattler largely rejected. He called 2 character witnesses for Blackthorn, businessmen from the eastern districts who testified to his reputation as an employer and a figure of the community, and Crane cross-examined them with the patient, unhurried efficiency of a man who had done this many times before. At 4 o'clock, Judge Sattler called a recess until the following morning. Wyatt was in the courthouse corridor when Blackthorn came out with his lawyers. Their paths crossed in the way of people leaving the same room, unavoidably, and for a moment they were standing about 8 feet apart in the corridor while people moved around them. Blackthorn looked at him. His face was set and controlled, but behind the pale eyes something had changed from the morning. The absolute certainty was still there, but it was working harder now, pushing against something. "Your man Voss has committed perjury," Blackthorn said, conversationally, like they were discussing weather. "We'll establish that tomorrow." "You can try," Wyatt said. "He's my nephew," Blackthorn said. "He was always unstable, always looking for—" "Blackthorn," Wyatt said. He didn't say it loudly, just said it. "Go talk to your lawyers." Blackthorn looked at him for another moment. Then he walked away. Checked. Crane found Wyatt on the courthouse steps at the end of the day, where Wyatt had been standing in the cold, watching the street and trying to work out how tomorrow felt. "He's going to try to settle tonight," Crane said. "Can he?" "He's going to try. His lawyers will reach out to my office with an offer." Crane paused. "I won't accept it." "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that this isn't about a settlement. What Voss brought in today, those records, that's not something you make go away with a payment. That's something you answer for." He looked at the street. "Sattler knows it too. I've appeared before her twice before. She's not going to let this close quietly." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "How do you think it goes tomorrow?" Crane considered this with the honesty he brought to most things. "Fitch is going to attack Voss," he said. "Personally. Try to establish bias, instability, personal grievance against his uncle. He'll spend most of the morning on it." He paused. "But the records exist. The names exist. Fitch can argue about motivation all day. He can't make those ledger entries disappear." "And the children's testimony stands," Crane said simply. 3 witnesses, consistent, specific, no material contradictions. That's solid ground." He paused. May was... He stopped, and Wyatt had the sense that Crane was choosing something more precise than his first word. "She was exceptional," he said. "I've worked with adult witnesses who couldn't hold a cross-examination the way she did today." "I know," Wyatt said. He looked at the courthouse door, at the stone steps, at the street below. He was thinking about tomorrow. He was also thinking about 6 months from now, and a year from now, and what came after whatever this was resolved into. "Crane," he said, "about the children. Legally. After this." Crane looked at him. "What about them? What are the options?" "For their situation. Their custody, I suppose." Crane studied him with the careful look he used when he was deciding how much to say. "That's a different legal process from this one," he said. "But it's not a complicated one in principle. A formal petition. A judge's approval. References from people the court considers reliable." He paused. It would help to have the support of a territorial marshal, hypothetically. Hypothetically, Wyatt said.
Hypothetically, Crane said.
He looked at the street. Get some sleep, Wyatt. Tomorrow's going to be long. It was May who found Wyatt that night. He was sitting on the small back step of the boarding house in the cold, which was not comfortable but was outside, which was what he needed. He heard the door behind him, and then she sat down beside him without asking, which was also characteristic. They sat for a while. How are you doing? He asked. Fine, she said, which was her default answer to that question and always had been. May.
A pause. Tired, she said. It was a lot. Saying all of it out loud in front of all those people. She stopped. I knew what had happened. I was there, but saying it out loud made it feel different, realer somehow, which doesn't make sense because it was always real. It makes sense, he said. Saying things out loud changes them a little, not the facts, just how they sit in you. She was quiet. Above them, the stars were out in full, dense and cold and very far.
That man Voss, she said. He was at the camp sometimes, during inspections. I know, Wyatt said. He never did anything when he came through. Her voice was flat. He saw things, and he didn't do anything, and he just kept his records. No, Wyatt agreed. He didn't do anything for 2 years. And now he gets immunity. Yes. She sat with that. He could feel her working through it. The particular unfairness of it. The way the world's accounting sometimes came out to numbers that didn't feel like justice, even when they were the best available version of it. Crane says the records are more valuable than a prosecution of Voss would be, he said.
I know you, she said. I understand that. It's just... She stopped. It's not even about him. It's just that nobody ever... She stopped again. Her jaw worked. Nobody ever did anything she said finally, and there was something underneath the flat voice now, something that had been packed down for a very long time and was making itself known around the edges. For 3 years, people came and went and saw things and nobody did anything. Why does it take so long? Why does it always take so long for anybody to do anything?
He didn't have a good answer for that. He had an honest one. Because it's hard, he said, and people are afraid. And men like Blackthorne make themselves into something that looks too large to fight. He paused. But you fought it. You got 6 people out of there and across 18 miles, and you found your way here, and you sat in that room today and said exactly what happened in front of him and his lawyers and everyone. He looked at her. That's not nothing, May. That's the thing that made today possible. She looked at the stars for a long moment.
Wyatt, she said, after tomorrow, after all of this, what happens to us?
He had thought about how to answer this question, and he had decided that the answer he gave her would be the honest one even if it wasn't yet complete. I've spoken to Crane, he said. There's a legal process for me to, formally, to make it official that you all belong with me. He paused. If that's what you want, all of you. She was very still. You'd have to decide, he said. Each of you. I'm not making that decision for you. She looked at him then, and for the first time since he'd known her, the careful, composed expression on her face did something unexpected. It didn't break exactly. May's face didn't break, probably couldn't. But something in it shifted, changed quality, became something younger and less managed and more real. I already decided, she said. Her voice was very quiet. A while ago. He nodded. He didn't say anything else because he didn't need to. They sat together in the cold night air and looked at the stars, and somewhere across town in a room Wyatt couldn't see, the last night of Edgar Blackthorne's untouchable life was winding toward its end, and neither of them thought very much about that. They sat and breathed the cold air and let the quiet be what it was. Tomorrow would be what it would be. They would walk into that courtroom and say true things, and the true things would be enough or they wouldn't. And if they weren't enough, they would figure out the next thing. That was how it worked. But Wyatt thought they would be enough. He thought so in the careful, provisional way he'd learned to think about things he hoped for. Not counting on it, not afraid of wanting it, just holding it. The way you held something you'd found on the road that you weren't sure was yours yet, but were taking home anyway, to see. The verdict came on a Friday. It wasn't dramatic, the way verdicts were sometimes described. No gasping gallery, no gavel pounding, no moment of cinematic weight dropping into the room from a great height. What happened was that Judge Honorine Sattler came in at 9:30 in the morning, sat down, looked at her notes for approximately 45 seconds, in a silence so complete you could hear the buildings settle around them, and then delivered her findings in the same unhurried, precise voice she used for everything. The findings were these. Edgar Blackthorne was guilty of unlawful detention of minors, guilty of labor procurement by fraudulent means, guilty of conspiracy to defraud the territorial court system through payments to sitting judicial officers, guilty of falsification of labor contracts. On the charge of criminal negligence in the death of a child in his care, the boy named Ferris, whom Eli had described, she found sufficient cause to refer the matter to a higher court for separate criminal proceedings. She read each finding clearly and without inflection, and she looked at Blackthorne while she read them, and Blackthorne, for the first time in the 4 days of proceedings, did not maintain the expression of a man who found this mildly boring. What replaced it wasn't quite what Wyatt had expected. He'd thought it might be rage, or the cold, recalculating mask Blackthorne wore when he was adapting his approach. What he saw instead was something flatter than either of those. An absence, almost. The look of a man who had organized the entire architecture of his life around the premise that his will was the final determining factor in any situation, and was confronting, for possibly the first time, the actual limits of that.
Fitch leaned in and said something. Blackthorne didn't respond to it visibly. He was looking at the judge, or past her, at something else. When Sattler finished reading the findings, she set her papers down and said, "The defendant is remanded to the custody of the Territorial Marshal's office pending transfer to the district court for formal sentencing proceedings and the separate criminal referral. Court is adjourned." She rose. The room rose. Blackthorne was still seated when the deputies moved to him. He stood when they reached him, slowly, with the movements of a very controlled man making himself perform a thing he found beneath him. He didn't look at the children on his way out. Wyatt thought that was deliberate. Not weakness, but the last assertion of a man who'd decided that acknowledging them was the one concession he would not make. Crane was at Wyatt's shoulder almost immediately. "It's done," he said quietly. "For now," Wyatt said. "The higher court referral on Ferris, that will take months. His lawyers will appeal the rest. It won't be clean." "Is it ever?" Crane thought about that. "No," he said. "Not in my experience." He paused. "But he's in custody. The operation on the Harrow River has been suspended pending investigation. The 3 judicial officials named in Voss's records have been placed on administrative leave." He looked at the door where Blackthorne had gone out. "His reach is cut. That's real, even if the rest takes time." Wyatt nodded. He was looking at May. She was standing near the end of the gallery bench, not watching the door where Blackthorne had exited, but looking at nothing in particular. Looking inward, maybe, at the space where 3 years of a particular kind of dread had lived and was now, if not gone, at least no longer active in the same way. Her face was doing something complicated. Several things at once, in fact, in the way faces did when they were processing things too large to resolve into a single expression. Eli was beside her. He had one hand on the back of the bench in front of him, gripping it slightly, and he was watching Blackthorne's empty chair with the expression of someone completing a conversation they'd been in the middle of for a very long time. Petra was already at the door, waiting for the rest of them. Her hands were in her pockets. She was looking at the street through the courthouse window. Wyatt went to May. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stood beside her in the space that opened up when other people moved away. "Okay," he said. She looked up at him. "I don't know yet," she said, which was the most honest thing she'd said about herself in the entire time he'd known her. "That's all right," he said. She looked at the empty chair where Blackthorne had sat. "Is it finished?" "This part of it," he said. "The rest takes time." She was quiet. Then, in a voice so quiet he almost missed it under the sound of the room clearing, "He looked smaller than I remembered." Wyatt looked at the empty chair, too. "They usually do," he said, "when they can't do anything to you anymore." She thought about that. Then she turned away from the chair and toward the door, and Wyatt went with her. They were back at the ranch by Sunday evening. The journey back was different from the journey out. Not easier exactly, but differently weighted. The cold was the same. The road was the same,
packed snow still hard in the shadows and beginning to soften where the afternoon light hit it, which meant spring was somewhere further along the calendar than it felt. But the quality of the silence in the wagon was different, less braced. Cobb fell asleep against May's arm before they'd been on the road an hour. She let him, adjusting her position to accommodate his weight without waking him, in the automatic way of a person accustomed to managing other people's comfort. She didn't look like she minded. Ruth sang for a while. Not the fragment of her mother's song this time, but something she made up as she went, a loose, structureless thing with words that didn't always rhyme, and a tune that wandered wherever it felt like going. Sable listened to it with her eyes closed and her head tipped back against the wagon board. Eli rode for the last stretch of the journey on horseback beside Wyatt, which had become something of a pattern in the days since the courthouse. The boy had taken to Dunn with the particular absorption of someone who was learning a new thing and finding it a useful place to put his attention. He wasn't a natural rider yet, but he was paying attention, which was the more important quality. "What happens to Voss?" he asked, somewhere on the last ridge before the ranch came into view. "He keeps his immunity," Wyatt said. "Stays out of the territory for a while," Crane said. "Tries to put together a life somewhere else." Eli was quiet for a moment, managing Dunn's footing on a patch of ice. "Do you think he'll be okay?" "I have no idea," Wyatt said. "He did the right thing in the end. That matters, even if it came late." "Does it cancel out the time before? When he didn't?" "No," Wyatt said. "I don't think it works like canceling. I think it just adds. The ledger doesn't go away, but neither does what he did." Eli thought about that. He was developing, Wyatt had noticed, the habit of sitting with ideas rather than moving immediately to what he thought about them. That was something. A lot of people never managed it. "I keep thinking about what I want to do," Eli said. "Later, when I'm older." "What are you thinking? Something with land, maybe?" He paused, almost self-conscious about it. Not just working land, surveying it, mapping it. You said you did that." "I did," Wyatt said, "for 11 years. What was it like?" Wyatt thought about how to answer that honestly. "It was cold most of the time," he said, "and lonely. And some of it was beautiful in a way that's hard to describe to someone who hasn't seen it." He paused. "It suited me at the time. I was better with terrain than I was with people." Eli glanced at him sideways. "And now?" Wyatt looked at the wagon ahead of them, at the shapes of the children visible over the sideboard. "Now I'm getting practice," he said. The ranch in February still looked like what it was, a working property in the middle of a hard winter, functional rather than pretty, with the barn roof sagging on the east side and the paint on the house worn to almost nothing and the fence line that needed attention in at least 4 places. It was not the kind of place that struck people as welcoming from the outside. But when they came through the gate in the last light of the evening, with the smoke starting from the chimney because Holt had ridden ahead to get the fire going, and the lamplight coming on in the windows one by one, it looked like something. Wyatt wasn't sure what word to put on it exactly. Not perfect, not transformed, just occupied, in the way a place was when it had people in it who were supposed to be there. Cobb woke when the wagon stopped and looked around at the ranch yard with sleepy, adjusting eyes and said, "We're home." Nobody had used that word before about this place. Wyatt heard it from outside the wagon as he was tying off the horses, and he stood there for a moment with his hands on the reins and didn't do anything else. Inside behind him, May was lifting Cobb down from the wagon. "Yeah," she said quietly. "We're home." "Get." March came, and then April, and the snow came off the ridge in stages, and the mud season arrived to replace it, which was its own kind of difficulty. The yard a churned mess, the road to Harlan's Crossing barely passable for 2 weeks, everything that had been clean and still under the snow now revealed as needing attention. Wyatt had forgotten how much work a ranch produced in the thaw. He had help now, which changed the arithmetic of it. Eli took to the outdoor work with the focused energy of someone who'd spent years being given work he hated and was now discovering what work he chose felt like. He wasn't always efficient. There was a period in early March where he spent 3 days trying to repair the barn roof by a method that Wyatt could see wouldn't hold and let him try anyway, because the lesson of figuring out why something didn't work was worth more than the time it cost. When the repair failed in a moderate wind and Eli came inside looking disgusted with himself, Wyatt showed him the right approach without comment on the previous attempt, and they fixed it together in an afternoon. Petra helped with the animals with the same quiet thoroughness she brought to everything. She was particularly good with Dunn, who was old enough to have opinions about being handled, and young enough people to simply have worked around his opinions rather than addressing them. Petra addressed them. She spent about a week just standing near the horse without asking anything of him, and then another week introducing contact in small increments. And by the end of April, Dunn would let her pick up his feet without the performance he generally put on for everyone else. He trusts her, Eli said, watching this from the fence one morning. She gave him time, Wyatt said. Didn't push him, just made herself a presence he understood wasn't a threat. Eli looked at him. You did that with us, he said. Wyatt looked at the fence post he was repairing, which didn't need as much attention as he was giving it. I was mostly just trying not to frighten anyone, he said. That counts, Eli said. The formal adoption proceedings took most of April. Crane handled the bulk of the legal mechanics. A petition filed with the territorial court, documentation of the children's circumstances, a formal home evaluation conducted by an official from the county seat who spent 2 days at the ranch asking questions that ranged from practical to oddly philosophical. Wyatt answered them all directly. He wasn't going to perform for the process. If the honest version of his household wasn't sufficient, he'd deal with that. It was sufficient. The judge who signed the final papers was not honoring Sattler. That was outside her jurisdiction. But a man named Archibald Poole, who had a reputation for doing things slowly and carefully and then not revisiting them. He reviewed the documentation over the course of a week, asked Crane 3 follow-up questions, asked Wyatt 1, and signed on a Thursday afternoon in early May. Crane brought the papers out to the ranch himself. He rode in on a clear afternoon when the mud had finally dried enough to make the road reasonable, tied his horse at the gate, and came up to the porch where Wyatt was replacing a board that had started to splinter over the winter. It's done, Crane said, and held out the papers. Wyatt set down his tools and took them. He read through them. All 6 names, all 6 entries, each one formal and final and recorded in the territorial court's official record. He read them carefully, the way he read important things, which was more than once. Then he folded them and put them in his coat pocket. Thank you, he said. He meant it for more than the papers, and from the way Crane looked at him, Crane understood that. Get them enrolled in the school at Harlan's Crossing, Crane said. Come fall. Pryor runs it. He's decent. I was planning on it. Crane nodded. He looked at the house, at the yard, at the scatter of evidence of 6 children occupying a space, a ball near the fence, a pair of small boots drying on the porch rail, the sound of voices from inside the barn. He took it in with the expression of a man cataloging something he wanted to remember accurately. You did something here, Wyatt, he said. We did something, Wyatt said. Crane looked at him. Don't be modest about the wrong things, he said mildly. He untied his horse, mounted, and rode back down the road. That evening, Wyatt called everyone to the kitchen table. This in itself was not unusual. They ate together every evening and had, from the first night, the table long enough to accommodate everyone if some of them were on the bench and Cobb sat on a stacked pair of books to get the right height. But tonight he'd told them before supper that there was something he wanted to say, and so they came in with the particular attentiveness of people who understood that something was being marked. He stood at the head of the table. He looked at them, all 6 of them looking back at him, each face different, each carrying different versions of the same history and different versions of where they were now. May with her direct dark eyes and the chin that was always slightly lifted. Eli with his arms folded and his jaw set in the way it went when he was trying to be steady about something that moved him. Petra sitting perfectly still, watching. The twins side by side as always, Rue's legs swinging, Sable's still. Cobb with his hands flat on the table and his round face completely open, because Cobb at 4 years old had not yet learned to arrange his expressions around what he was feeling. Wyatt reached into his coat pocket and took out the papers. He didn't make a speech about it. He wasn't built for speeches, and he didn't try. These came today, he said, from the court. He set the papers on the table so they could all see them. It means that legally, officially, this is your home. And I am... He paused. Not because he didn't know the word, but because saying it out loud was its own kind of thing, different from thinking it, different from having decided it. I'm your father. in every way the law knows how to say it. The table was quiet. Cobb looked at the papers and then at Wyatt and said, "Does that mean I don't have to go anywhere?" "You don't have to go anywhere," Wyatt said. Cobb accepted this with the completeness that only very young children could manage. Full, immediate, without the qualifications that older people brought to good news because they'd learned good news could be taken back. He nodded once and looked at the papers again with an expression of satisfied certainty. Rue made a sound that was not quite a word. Sable reached over and took her hand. Eli was looking at the papers with the expression he used for things he needed to process slowly. He didn't say anything, but after a moment he looked up at Wyatt and held his gaze for a second, and Wyatt held it back, and that was enough. Petra put her hand on the table near the papers, not quite touching them, just near, as if checking that they were real. May was looking at him. She'd been looking at him since he'd put the papers down, with an expression he'd gotten better at reading over the months. The one that wasn't performed, wasn't managed, wasn't the composed face she put on for difficulty. The real one, which was younger and less certain and more present. "Is this what you want?" she said. It was the same thing he'd asked her in the dark on the back steps in Delworth. She was giving it back to him, not as an echo but as a genuine question, making sure, the way she always made sure of things that mattered. "Yes," he said. "This is what I want." She held his gaze for another moment. Then she nodded, once, the same short, contained motion she'd used that first night at the ranch when he'd told her he wasn't putting them out. The motion that meant she'd decided something and wasn't revisiting it. "Okay," she said. There were things that didn't resolve cleanly, because things rarely did. The criminal referral on Ferris's death worked through the higher court system for the better part of a year, and Blackthorn's lawyers were skilled enough at delay that the proceedings stretched and stretched. There were weeks when it seemed like money and time might accomplish what force and legal maneuvering hadn't. Wyatt followed the updates through Crane's occasional letters and didn't let himself feel certain about any of it until the day, in late autumn of that year, when Crane wrote to say that the higher court had issued its ruling and that Blackthorn had been sentenced to a term that would, given his age and the conditions, amount to the rest of his natural life. Wyatt read the letter at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning and then set it down and drank his coffee. May came in from outside. She'd been checking the chickens, a chore she'd taken over with the same organizational competence she brought to everything, and looked at the letter on the table and looked at his face. "Crane's letter?" she said. "Yes." She sat down across from him. "And?" he told her. She listened with her hands wrapped around her own cup, her eyes on the table, her expression doing the complicated thing it did when she was processing something that had several layers to it simultaneously. "Is it enough?" she asked. "For what he did?" "I don't know," Wyatt said. "Probably not. The thing he did to Ferris, the years he took from all of you, I don't know what would be enough for that." He paused. "But it's what the law could do. And the law did it." She thought about that. "I keep thinking about Ferris," she said. "That he doesn't know? That wherever he is, he doesn't know this happened." Wyatt looked at the letter. "I think about that too," he said. "It should matter that he doesn't know," May said. "It should matter to somebody." "It matters to you," he said, "and to Eli. And it mattered to Crane, and to Sattler, and to Voss, however late he got there." He looked at her. "The fact that Ferris isn't here to see it doesn't make it not real. The fact that someone fought for it anyway. That matters too." She was quiet for a long time. Outside, through the window, the autumn light was thin and gold across the yard, the kind of light that only happened for a few weeks in October on this ridge before the cold took it. Eli was visible through the window, working the fence line on the far side of the yard. Petra was somewhere in the barn. Cobb's voice carried from inside the house, asking Rue something about the map book. "I want to do something," May said. "For Ferris, I don't know what. Something that says—" She stopped, working at the edges of something she hadn't quite found the words for. "That says someone remembered, that it wasn't just business, that it wasn't just numbers in a ledger." Wyatt thought about that. "We could plant something," he said. "In the spring, a tree maybe, on the south slope where the light's good." He paused. "Put his name on a marker." She looked at him. "Just Ferris? We don't know his last name." "Just Ferris," he said. "That's what you knew him as. That's what he was." She was quiet for another moment, then, Yes, she said. That's what we'll do. They sat together in the October morning light, and Wyatt looked at his coffee and felt the weight of what the year had been. The long winter, the courthouse, the months of waiting, the paperwork and the letters, and the slow, grinding work of legal process. He felt the tiredness of it, which he hadn't let himself feel fully until now, and underneath the tiredness, something else. Something he'd stopped expecting to find in this house. Not happiness, exactly. He was suspicious of happiness as a concept. It seemed to him like one of those words that describe the absence of specific bad things more accurately than it described the presence of specific good ones. What he felt was more like fullness, a sense of weight to the days that came from the days containing more than one person's life. He hadn't known how empty a house could feel until it wasn't empty anymore. He hadn't known that the opposite of grief was not joy, but rather just presence. Other people, present. Time moving in a direction instead of pooling. Maze. That winter, Wyatt started teaching. Not formally. He was not a school teacher and had no intention of becoming one. But the evenings were long, and the children were there, and they had between them a significant appetite for understanding things. So he taught Eli the basics of survey work, how to read a compass, how to triangulate a position, how to translate what you saw in landscape into notation on paper. He taught Petra to identify trees by their bark in winter, when the leaves were gone and you had to work from texture and shape. He taught the twins to ride properly, which took more sessions than he'd anticipated because Rue was fearless in ways that were sometimes a problem, and Sable was cautious in ways that were sometimes also a problem, and getting them to meet somewhere in the middle required its own kind of creativity. May he taught to shoot. She'd already known the basics, had demonstrated that on the first night when she'd held his rifle with competent hands. But knowing the basics and understanding the full mechanics were different things, and May, when she decided to understand something, was thorough about it. They spent Saturday mornings through December out behind the barn, working through distance and wind and the way cold affected both the shooter and the shot. She was not a natural. She was, however, relentlessly analytical about her own errors, which was different from natural and in some ways more useful. "I'm pulling left," she said, one morning in December, looking at the target they'd set up against the far fence post. "You're anticipating the recoil," he said. "You tense up a half second before the shot." "How do I stop doing that?" "Breathe," he said. "Hold it a beat longer than you think you need to. The shot should almost surprise you when it goes." She tried it, pulled left again, but less. "Better," he said. She tried it again, this time close to center. She lowered the rifle and looked at it and then at the target. She didn't say anything, but the expression on her face was the quiet, contained version of satisfaction. The one that didn't announce itself but was there. "Why do you want to learn this?" he asked. He'd asked it before, early in the sessions, and she hadn't answered. She was quiet for a moment, looking down range. "Because you ran across an open yard," she said, "when the man was in the barn." She paused. "If I'd known how to shoot properly, you might not have had to." He looked at her profile. She was 9 now. Had turned 9 in November, which they'd marked with a meal that Mrs. Ferris had sent a recipe for and that Petra had cooked with the systematic precision she brought to new tasks. 9 years old, standing in the December cold with a rifle in her hands, articulating the precise nature of her own debt to the people she considered her responsibility. "May," he said, "you are not responsible for protecting everyone around you." She looked at him. "I know," she said, in a tone that suggested she had not yet actually accepted this. "You can learn to shoot because you want to know how," he said. "That's a fine reason, but not because you feel like you owe someone a debt." She thought about that for a long moment. "What if both things are true?" she said. He considered that honestly. "Then both things are true," he said. "Just make sure the first one, the wanting to know, is the one that's driving it. The other one has a way of making itself too heavy to carry." She was quiet. She raised the rifle and fired again. This time, center. She lowered it, looked at the target. "I want to know," she said. "Good," he said. "So we'll keep going." Spring came back to the ranch in the particular way it always came to high country. Grudgingly, in stages. One warm day followed by 2 cold ones, the snow retreating up the ridge in steps rather than all at once. But it came. It always came. They planted Ferris's tree on the south slope on a Saturday in April, when the ground was soft enough to work. A young aspen, because aspens came back even when they were cut down, the root system persisted and threw up new growth from below, one tree becoming many over time. Wyatt didn't say that out loud. Some things were better left to mean what they meant without being explained. All 6 children came for it. Eli dug the hole. He'd asked to, and Wyatt had let him. May put the marker in herself, a flat piece of river stone she'd found in March, and had Wyatt help her scratch a name into. Ferris. Just the one word. Just the name. They stood around it for a while in the April afternoon. Nobody said anything formal. Cobb looked at the stone with the serious attention he gave to important things, and then he picked a handful of the early grass that was coming up around it and laid it against the stone because he was 5 years old, and that was how he knew to mark something. Nobody told him it was a good gesture. It was just a gesture, and it was his, and it was enough. On the walk back to the house, Eli fell in step beside Wyatt and said, "I think it's the right tree. Aspens grow in groups." "They do," Wyatt said. "He was part of a group," Eli said. "Even at the end. He wasn't alone." Wyatt looked at him. "No," he said. "He wasn't." Pashot. There is a thing that happens to some people, not all, not often, where life, after breaking them, doesn't simply leave them broken. It rearranges them, not into the original shape because that shape is gone, but into something that fits the new reality, the way a river rearranges its bed after a flood. Not the same river exactly, but still water, still moving, still finding its way to lower ground. Wyatt Mercer had expected to die on that ranch. Not dramatically, not by violence or accident, but by the slow attrition of a man who'd stopped seeing any particular reason to continue. He hadn't made a decision about it. He'd just stopped expecting anything different. He was wrong. He'd been wrong about other things too. About how long it took for trust to build. About how much noise 6 children actually made versus how much he'd imagined they would. About the specific experience of being called Dad for the first time, which happened one evening in February when Cobb said it without thinking, and then looked alarmed, and then looked at Wyatt to see if it was all right. And Wyatt said it was all right, and after that it was. About the other things, the harder things, he was more tentative in his conclusions. He thought about Clara and Lena and Ben every day, still. Not with the tearing quality of early grief, which really did ease over time the way he'd told Eli it would, but with the specific permanent ache of people who had shaped you and were no longer present to see what you'd become. He thought sometimes that they would have liked May's stubbornness. He thought Clara would have had strong opinions about the roof and been right about all of them. He thought Lena would have immediately understood the twins' private language and joined it without being asked. These thoughts were not comfortable. He no longer needed them to be. What he knew by the time the second spring came to the ranch was this: that family was not a thing you were handed. It was a thing you built out of the materials available to you with whatever hands you had. It was imprecise work. It left gaps and rough edges. It required constantly the decision to keep going when the easier thing was to stop. The children he had now were not replacements for the children he'd lost. That was not how any of it worked, and he would have been doing everyone a disservice to pretend it was. They were who they were. New people, with their own histories and their own shapes. He was learning them the way you learned anything that mattered, slowly, with attention, and with the understanding that you would never fully finish. May would turn 10 in November and was already, in certain lights, beginning to look like someone who had a future she was deciding on rather than simply surviving toward. Eli had written to a survey school in the eastern part of the territory, a first inquiry, very formal, in the careful handwriting he'd taught himself from the one textbook Wyatt owned. Petra had asked, in her direct way, whether there were books she could borrow from the school at Harlan's Crossing, and when Wyatt said he thought there probably were, she'd nodded and started planning which ones she wanted first. Rue sang constantly. Sable had started drawing, small, exact pictures of things she saw, rendered in a spare style that showed she understood already that simplicity could carry more weight than complexity. Cobb was 5 years old and learning to read with the dedicated, stumbling focus of someone tackling something difficult for the first time and refusing to admit it was difficult. These were not miracles. They were just children growing up. But a year ago, growing up had not been a certainty for any of them, and so there was something in the ordinary fact of it,
The homework and the chores and the arguments and the muddy boots and the meals and the evenings by the fire that Wyatt did not take entirely for granted. He tried not to. That was the honest version of it. He didn't always manage it. Some days the ordinariness of the life swallowed the awareness of what it had cost to get there, and the day was just a day, which was also fine. That was what normal felt like, and normal was what they were all, in their different ways and at their different paces, learning to occupy. The ranch, by the second spring, had been repaired in the ways most in need of repair. The barn roof, the fence lines, the south wall of the house that had developed a draft over the winter. It still wasn't pretty. The paint was still mostly gone. The yard was still a muddy mess for 6 weeks in spring. There was always something that needed attention, and always only so many hours in the day. But the woodpile stayed full. The kitchen was warm. There were 6 pairs of boots drying on the porch rail in various stages of disrepair. And the sound of voices from inside the barn carried across the yard on still mornings. And the aspen on the south slope was leafing out for the first time. Wyatt stood on the porch one evening in May and looked at all of it in the last light of the day. The ridge going purple in the west, the yard quiet for once, the house behind him full of small sounds of ordinary life. He stood there and let it be what it was. He was not a man who had everything. He was a man who had what he needed and some of what he'd stopped thinking he deserved. And he understood well enough now that those two things were not always different. He went inside. 6 voices came at him from different parts of the house. May asking something about supper. Cobb announcing something about a frog he'd found. Eli calling from the barn that the east gate latch was loose again. The usual things, the constant, specific, irreplaceable things. Wyatt hung up his coat and went to answer them. That was how it went. That was how it continued to go. And that was enough.